My name is Howard. I am 70 years old, and what I am about to tell you will forever change the way you understand family wealth and the quiet power of a calloused hand. I spent 45 years working at the shipyards building a life penny by penny, while my wife Josephine sacrificed her hands and her youth to the soil, raising the money to put our son through the best universities. We thought we were building a legacy. Instead, we built a monster. Last weekend at an exclusive Michelin star restaurant, my daughter-in-law Victoria laughed and called my wife's hands rough and filthy. My son Brandon simply agreed under the glittering lights, telling his mother to hide her hands so as not to embarrass his high society friends. I did not yell. I simply set my glass down, held those calloused hands, and waited for the guest of honor. When the billionaire developer walked into the room and headed straight toward us, their perfect, arrogant world shattered into pieces. Before I tell you the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that hard work and dignity should never be mocked by those who inherited everything. The evening began with the kind of suffocating tension that only money and arrogance can buy. The restaurant Le Jardin was a cathedral of glass and steel in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where a single appetizer cost more than my first weekly paycheck. The air smelled of expensive truffles and imported wine. We were gathered to celebrate Victoria's 32nd birthday. She was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table wearing a silver silk dress that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers above. Her friends, a collection of corporate vice presidents and trust fund heirs, flanked her on both sides, laughing loudly and clinking champagne glasses. Josephine and I were seated at the far end of the table near the swinging doors to the kitchen. The placement was not an accident. It was a deliberate, silent exile. We were the obligatory relatives invited for the optics, but positioned out of sight. I wore my best dark suit, the one I bought a decade ago, and Josephine wore a simple, elegant navy dress she had sewn herself. She looked beautiful to me, carrying the quiet dignity of a woman who had weathered storms and built a life from scratch. The conversation around the table flowed smoothly, a rapid exchange of stock tips, European vacations, and luxury real estate acquisitions. Victoria dominated the discussion, her voice ringing with the crisp, rehearsed confidence of a woman accustomed to getting her way. She was currently the procurement director for a major eco-resort development firm, a position she never failed to mention. I watched her hold court, noticing how she deliberately ignored the presence of her husband's parents. Then, the inevitable happened. The waiter brought the main courses, placing a delicate porcelain plate in front of Josephine. As my wife reached for her water glass, her hand moved into the light. Her hands were strong, deeply tanned, and marked by a lifetime of hard work. The skin was rough, the knuckles prominent, bearing the faint, permanent stains of soil and sap that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. Victoria paused mid-sentence. Her eyes locked onto Josephine's hand, narrowing with a sudden, vicious glint. She leaned forward, the smile dropping from her face, replaced by an expression of pure, theatrical disgust. "Josephine, please," Victoria said, her voice loud enough to cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. The chatter around the table died instantly. "Look at your hands. They are completely rough. They are practically filthy. We are eating off Limoges porcelain tonight. Do you mind keeping them off the table? It really ruins the aesthetic of the evening." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The wealthy guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, some hiding smirks behind their napkins. I felt a surge of heat rise in my chest, a sudden violent instinct to stand up and flip the entire mahogany table over. But I did not move. I looked at Josephine. She slowly withdrew her hand, her eyes dropping to her lap. The humiliation radiating from her was a physical blow. I turned my gaze to Brandon. My son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the man whose education we had financed with decades of backbreaking labor. He was sitting next to Victoria, swirling the wine in his glass. I waited for him to speak, to defend his mother, to show even a sliver of the respect we had raised him to possess. Brandon sighed, an exasperated sound that echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Mom, Victoria is right," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You could have at least worn gloves. Please just keep your hands under the table. You are embarrassing her in front of her friends." The words struck me harder than any physical violence ever could. My own son aligning himself with a woman who treated us like an infection. He was prioritizing the aesthetic approval of strangers over the dignity of the woman who gave him life. My jaw clenched tightly, the muscles in my face aching from the effort to remain perfectly still. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. Decades of working in harsh environments had taught me that shouting rarely solves a problem. It merely announces your lack of control. I slowly reached out, grabbed Josephine's hand, and brought it back onto the table, placing it firmly on top of mine, right in the center of the white tablecloth, fully illuminated by the chandelier. Brandon opened his mouth to protest, his face flushing with anger, but I shot him a look so cold, so entirely devoid of parental affection that he snapped his mouth shut. I squeezed Josephine's hand, feeling the rough, familiar texture of her calluses. Those calluses were not dirt. They were the physical evidence of 40 years spent crossbreeding hybrid roses, 40 years of kneeling in the damp earth before dawn, cultivating botanical variations that no one else in the country could master. Those rough hands had secured patents. Those rough hands had paid the mortgage when I was laid off from the shipyard. Those rough hands had funded Brandon's Ivy League tuition while we ate rice and beans for dinner. And now he sat there ashamed of the very foundation of his privileged existence. The tension at the table was unbearable. Victoria glared at us, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line, silently promising retribution for ruining her perfect image. She turned her attention away from us, checking her phone frantically, her demeanor shifting from arrogant hostility to desperate anxiety. "He should be here by now," she muttered to one of her friends. "Mr. Gallagher promised he would make an appearance. If he does not show, this whole dinner is a waste." Mr. Gallagher, the billionaire developer, the CEO of the resort company Victoria worked for, the man she believed held the key to her promotion to vice president. She had spent the last 20 minutes bragging about how close they were, how he valued her input above all others. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors at the front of the restaurant swung open. A tall, distinguished man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit walked in, flanked by two assistants. The maitre d' practically tripped over himself trying to intercept him, but the man waved him off, scanning the room with sharp, commanding eyes. It was Arthur Gallagher. Victoria gasped a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. She immediately stood up, smoothing the front of her silver dress and plastered a radiant, welcoming smile on her face. She practically pushed her chair back, stepping away from the table, preparing to intercept the billionaire and demonstrate her perceived importance to everyone in the room. "Mr. Gallagher." "Over here," she called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Gallagher heard her. He turned his head and saw Victoria waving enthusiastically. He began walking toward our table. Victoria extended her hand, the perfect picture of an ambitious, successful executive greeting her mentor. But Gallagher did not slow down. He did not extend his hand in return. He walked right past Victoria, the cold breeze of his movement causing her to stumble slightly backward in confusion. He ignored the vice presidents. He ignored the trust fund heirs. He ignored Brandon. Arthur Gallagher walked straight down the length of the table, his eyes fixed entirely on the shadows at the far end. He stopped directly in front of the two people Victoria had exiled to the back. He stopped directly in front of Josephine and me. Mr. Gallagher approached our table with long, purposeful strides. The heavy silence in the restaurant was broken only by the sharp click of his leather shoes against the polished marble floor. Victoria maintained her frozen smile, her hand still awkwardly extended in midair. Gallagher did not look at her. He stopped entirely in front of Josephine. The wealthy guests leaned forward in their chairs, their conversations completely dead. Gallagher bent forward in a slight formal bow. He reached out and gently took my wife's calloused, soil-stained hand. He raised it slightly, holding it with the reverence one might reserve for royalty. "Mrs. Josephine," Gallagher said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of absolute authority. "It is an honor to finally meet you in person. My team has spent months trying to secure a meeting with the genius behind the hybrid strains." Josephine smiled a quiet, graceful smile. "It is a pleasure, Mr. Gallagher. Howard and I prefer a private life." Gallagher turned slightly toward the bewildered crowd, his grip on Josephine's hand firm and respectful. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing off the high, gilded ceiling, "you are looking at the woman who single-handedly saved my eco-resort development in the Caribbean. Her exclusive botanical patents are the only reason we secured the global environmental certifications. Her rough hands built the foundation of a billion-dollar enterprise." The words struck the room like physical blows. The trust fund heirs stopped breathing. The corporate vice president stared in absolute shock. The narrative Victoria had carefully constructed, the image of her poor, embarrassing in-laws, shattered instantly. Gallagher had just validated Josephine as the most valuable asset in his entire empire. He did not care about the Limoges porcelain. He cared about the dirt under her fingernails. Victoria stood entirely paralyzed. Her silver silk dress seemed to lose its luster. The confident, mocking executive from 5 minutes ago had vanished, replaced by a woman realizing she had just publicly humiliated the singular supplier keeping her boss's company afloat. Her eyes darted from Gallagher to Josephine, wide with a terror she could not mask. Brandon sat beside her, his face completely drained of color. He looked at his mother's hands, the hands he had just told her to hide, with a sudden horrified comprehension. He had spent his entire life ashamed of the soil that had built a fortune he knew absolutely nothing about. Gallagher released Josephine's hand and pulled up a chair right next to us. He signaled to the waiter for a fresh glass of champagne, completely ignoring Victoria, whose birthday dinner had effectively ceased to exist. He engaged Josephine in a deep conversation about soil acidity and climate resilience. The rest of the table sat in miserable silence. The wealthy friends who had snickered earlier now looked at Josephine with desperate, calculating interest. Victoria tried to interject twice, attempting to discuss a procurement timeline, but Gallagher dismissed her with a single sharp wave of his hand. He treated Howard and Josephine as the only important people in the room. The birthday party was completely ruined. Josephine and I stayed for exactly 20 minutes. We finished our water, politely declined the dessert course, and excused ourselves. Gallagher stood up immediately, shaking my hand and bowing to Josephine once more. He handed her a private business card, insisting they schedule a tour of her greenhouse. We walked out of the restaurant with our heads held high, leaving Victoria drowning in the silence of her ruined event. The cool night air hit my face as we walked toward the parking valet. I handed the attendant my ticket. A few minutes later, my reliable 10-year-old truck pulled up to the curb. I opened the door for Josephine, ensuring she was comfortable before walking around to the driver's side. Before I could reach the door handle, a sleek black sedan screeched into the valet lane, stopping diagonally across the exit and entirely blocking my truck. The driver's door flew open. Brandon marched out, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. He had abandoned his wife's ruined birthday dinner to chase us into the parking lot. "What is going on?" Brandon yelled, ignoring the valet attendant who stepped back in alarm. "Why did Arthur Gallagher just bow to my mother?" I stood perfectly still, my hand resting on the door handle of my truck. I looked at my son, assessing the sheer entitlement radiating from his rigid posture. "Your mother holds botanical patents, Brandon. She breeds hybrid roses. She has done this for 40 years. Mr. Gallagher is a client." Brandon stepped closer, his voice rising in volume. "A client," he said. "Her patents saved his billion-dollar resort. He said she built the foundation of his empire. Why do you drive this old truck? Why do you let Victoria think you are broke? Why did you hide this massive wealth from me?" The demand in his voice was clear. He did not care about his mother's genius. He cared about the money he felt entitled to. "We did not hide anything," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "You simply never asked. You were too busy hiding us from your friends to notice what your mother was building in the backyard." Brandon slammed his fist against the hood of his sedan. "You humiliated Victoria in front of her boss. You ruined her party." "Victoria humiliated herself," I stated firmly. "Now move your car. Your mother is tired." Brandon glared at me, his chest heaving. For a second, he looked ready to argue further, but the cold finality in my eyes stopped him. He spun around, got back into his sedan, and aggressively reversed out of the lane, his tires squealing against the pavement. As his car sped away, I noticed something pale fluttering on the ground near where he had been standing. I walked over and picked it up. It was a crumpled envelope bearing the official logo of a high-tier bank dropped from Brandon's coat pocket during his tantrum. I unfolded the paper under the harsh glare of the parking lot lights. It was a final notice of foreclosure. The document detailed a massive unpaid debt. But the shock did not come from the amount. The shock came from the collateral listed at the bottom of the page. The bank was threatening to seize the generational farmland registered solely under Josephine's name. Josephine had never signed a mortgage document in her life. A felony had just been committed. The drive back to our quiet suburban neighborhood was enveloped in a comfortable, absolute silence. Josephine rested her head against the passenger window, her breathing steady and calm. We had successfully defended our dignity against unparalleled arrogance, and the night air felt remarkably clean. I turned my 10-year-old truck onto our street and pulled smoothly into the driveway. Before I could even shift the transmission into park, the blinding glare of high-beam headlights flooded my rearview mirror. A sleek black sedan screeched onto the concrete, swerving aggressively to block my truck from the street. The driver's side door flew open before the vehicle had even come to a complete halt. Brandon marched out into the cold night air. His face was flushed with a volatile mixture of severe embarrassment and unrestrained rage. He had completely abandoned his wife at the ruins of her own birthday dinner to chase us across town. I turned off the engine, stepped out of the truck, and walked around to help Josephine out of the passenger side. I gently instructed my wife to go inside the house and lock the front door. I stood perfectly still on the concrete, adjusting my jacket, and faced the man I had raised. Brandon closed the distance between us, his chest heaving with exertion. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He demanded to know why Arthur Gallagher had bowed to his mother. He screamed that our secrecy had intentionally humiliated Victoria in front of her entire corporate network. He wanted to know why we drove an old truck and lived in a modest house when we apparently commanded the respect of billionaires. His voice echoed down the quiet suburban street, breaking the midnight silence. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I looked at him with absolute emotional detachment. I told him that I did not owe a 35-year-old man a financial briefing on the assets his mother had built with her own two hands. I reminded him that he was the one who had told his mother to hide those hands under a tablecloth just an hour ago. Brandon demanded to know exactly how much money we were hiding. I stepped closer, closing the gap between us, and looked directly into his eyes. I ordered him to move his car off my property immediately before I called the police to have it towed. Brandon stared at me, his jaw dropping in absolute disbelief. He was entirely unaccustomed to hearing the word no from his parents. For his entire adult life, he had treated my bank account as his personal safety net, and he fully expected me to cave to his demands. He began to pace back and forth across the driveway in frantic, jerky movements. He ripped his coat open, running his hands over his face as he muttered curses under his breath. He threatened to cut us out of his life completely. He claimed that we had ruined his marriage and destroyed his social standing in a single evening. I remained silent, refusing to engage with his theatrical display. My silence only infuriated him further. Realizing that his intimidation tactics were completely ineffective against me, Brandon let out a loud, frustrated shout. He spun around on his heel, stomped back to his luxury sedan, and slammed the door with enough force to shake the vehicle. The engine roared to life. He threw the car into reverse, his tires squealing against the pavement, and sped away down the dark street. I watched his red taillights disappear around the corner, feeling a profound sense of finality. The son I had known was gone, replaced entirely by a stranger consumed by greed. I turned around and began walking toward the front porch. The motion sensor security light clicked on, illuminating the concrete driveway. Right where Brandon had been frantically pacing, a thick, crumpled envelope lay on the ground. It must have fallen from his coat pocket during his tantrum. I recognized the habit immediately. Ever since high school, Brandon had possessed a careless tendency to shove important documents into his coat pockets instead of filing them properly. I walked over and picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy and expensive. The return address printed in the top left corner belonged to a highly exclusive top-tier financial institution. The envelope had been opened hastily, the top edge torn and jagged. I held it in my hand, feeling a sudden sharp instinct that the contents of this letter would explain exactly why Victoria had been so desperate to secure her promotion tonight. My son was hiding a massive financial crisis. I knew I needed to read this document immediately before he realized it was missing. I walked up the porch steps, unlocked the front door, and stepped into the quiet warmth of my home. Josephine had already gone upstairs to prepare for bed, leaving me entirely alone in the hallway. I stood under the bright overhead light and carefully pulled the documents from the torn envelope. The first page was a final notice of default and impending foreclosure. The bank was demanding immediate payment for a massive multi-million-dollar commercial loan that had been sitting in severe arrears for over 6 months. I read the staggering numbers, understanding instantly why Brandon and Victoria were drowning in panic. They had built a lifestyle entirely funded by debt they could not afford to repay. But the true horror did not strike me until I reached the third page of the document. I scanned the legal description of the assets used to secure the loan. I expected to see Brandon's luxury home or Victoria's luxury vehicles listed as collateral. Instead, my eyes locked onto a highly specific parcel of real estate. The bank was preparing to seize 50 acres of prime agricultural land located just outside the city limits. That land was the generational farmland, registered exclusively under Josephine's name. It was the exact location where she had built her botanical research facility. I read the property description 3 times, my blood running completely cold. Josephine had owned that land free and clear for 30 years. She had absolutely never signed a mortgage agreement, nor had she ever authorized anyone else to use her life's work as financial leverage. The reality of the situation hit me with the force of a freight train. My son and his wife had not merely made poor financial decisions. They had orchestrated a massive fraud. They had deliberately forged Josephine's signature on federal banking documents to secure millions of dollars for their own personal use. A severe felony had been committed right under our noses. I folded the papers and slid them into my inner jacket pocket. My grief over losing my son was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating determination. They had targeted my wife. They had attempted to steal her legacy. The time for parental compassion was officially over. I would destroy their entire world. The sun had barely broken over the Chicago skyline when I pulled my truck into the parking lot of the main downtown branch of Sterling Mutual. I did not wake Josephine. She was still resting peacefully, entirely unaware that our only son had placed her life's work on the chopping block. I walked through the heavy glass doors the moment the bank opened to the public. The lobby was quiet, filled with the soft hum of air conditioning and the shuffling of junior tellers preparing their stations. I bypassed the velvet ropes and the main line, completely walking straight toward the glass-walled offices at the back of the floor. A young assistant stepped into my path, offering a polite but dismissive smile, asking if I had an appointment. I ignored her entirely. I pushed open the solid oak door bearing a brass plaque for the branch manager, Mr. Harrison. He was a man in his late 40s, wearing a tailored suit, sipping coffee while reviewing his morning emails. He looked up, his face flashing with immediate irritation at the sudden intrusion. I did not give him the opportunity to demand an explanation or exercise his corporate authority. I pulled the crumpled foreclosure notice from my inner jacket pocket and placed it flat on the center of his pristine desk. I placed my large, heavy hands on the edge of the wood and leaned forward. I told Mr. Harrison that the 50 acres of agricultural land listed as collateral on this default notice belonged exclusively to my wife. I informed him that Josephine had never stepped foot inside his bank, had never requested a commercial loan, and had never authorized a lien against her property. Harrison's irritation instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden rigid panic. He stammered, attempting to cite privacy regulations and corporate protocol to dismiss me. He reached for his desk phone to call security. I warned him that if he picked up that receiver, my next call would be directly to the Federal Fraud Division to report his branch for facilitating a multi-million-dollar grand larceny. I demanded the original physical master file for the loan application. I gave him exactly 60 seconds to retrieve it. Harrison looked at my face, read the absolute certainty in my eyes, and stood up without another word. He hurried out of the office, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the marble floor as he rushed to the records room. Mr. Harrison returned exactly 1 minute later, carrying a thick, legal-sized manila folder. He placed it on the desk with trembling hands, stepping back as if the documents were physically burning him. I opened the file and began to methodically review the contents. The paperwork outlined a staggering commercial loan distributed to a shell corporation registered under Brandon's name. I bypassed the financial ledgers and flipped directly to the final authorization pages. I needed to see the physical proof of the crime. I found the primary deed of trust. There on the bottom line was Josephine's name. I stared at the blue ink. The spelling was correct, but the execution was entirely wrong. The loop of the first letter was far too narrow, and the slant of the handwriting leaned heavily to the right. My mind immediately pulled a sharp memory from 2 decades ago. I remembered a 16-year-old Brandon standing in our kitchen handing me a high school history report card. He had intercepted the mail and attempted to hide his failing grades by forging his mother's signature. The tight, forced curvature of the letters on this multi-million-dollar banking document was an exact match to that old, desperate high school forgery. Brandon did not merely benefit from this crime. He physically executed the fraud with his own hands. I shifted my gaze to the notary stamp pressed forcefully beside the fake signature. It belonged to a corporate notary registered directly to Mr. Gallagher's luxury eco-resort development firm. The puzzle pieces locked together with flawless precision. Victoria had used her high-level executive access to bypass the mandatory physical presence requirement for the notarization. She had commanded a subordinate to illegally stamp a forged document providing the impenetrable legal armor Brandon needed to secure the funds. They had conspired together, combining his financial desperation with her corporate power. The sheer audacity of the operation did not make me angry. It solidified my rage into a weaponized, calculating strategy. They had treated my wife's legacy as an unprotected vault, assuming we were simply too old and too ignorant to notice the theft. I turned the page, searching for the initial loan application, but my fingers stopped completely. The document sitting behind the forged deed of trust was not a financial disclosure. It was printed on the official watermarked letterhead of a highly expensive private medical clinic. I read the bold capitalized title at the top of the page, It was a preliminary psychiatric evaluation. I scanned the clinical paragraphs, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The physician, a doctor I had never met or even heard of, described Josephine in horrifying detail. The report claimed she suffered from severe, unmanageable bouts of confusion. It stated she possessed a rapidly declining cognitive function, rendering her prone to erratic behavior and an inability to recognize her own family members. The doctor concluded that Josephine was entirely incapable of managing her own finances or making rational decisions regarding her estate. Attached directly behind this fabricated medical evaluation was a sworn, notarized affidavit. Brandon's authentic signature sat proudly at the bottom of the page. My own son had officially testified under penalty of perjury that his mother was suffering from advanced dementia. He had laid the exact legal groundwork required to strip Josephine of her autonomy. With this document on file, Brandon could seamlessly petition a judge to declare her incompetent. He could force her into a locked memory care facility against her will and assume total financial conservatorship over her entire estate. The loan was merely the beginning of his true objective. They did not just want to steal her money to cover their immediate debts. They wanted to erase her existence entirely, locking her away so they could freely consume everything we had spent a lifetime building. They viewed us not as parents, but as inconvenient obstacles standing in the way of their desired lifestyle. I carefully closed the thick manila folder and pushed it back across the desk toward the terrified branch manager. I looked at Mr. Harrison and instructed him to secure that file in his primary vault. I warned him that if a single page went missing, he would share a prison cell with my son. I walked out of the bank and stepped into the cold morning air. I knew exactly what I had to do next. The trap had to be set. The cold morning air bit at my face as I walked back to my truck. I barely had time to put the keys in the ignition before my phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID displayed Victoria's name. I let it ring 3 times, allowing her anxiety to build before answering with a neutral tone. Her voice came through the speaker dripping with an artificial, sugary sweetness that immediately set my teeth on edge. She apologized profusely for the events at the restaurant and blamed Brandon's driveway outburst on work-related stress. She claimed they both felt terrible and wanted to make amends by hosting a private reconciliation dinner at their home that very evening. I gripped the steering wheel, calculating her angle. The forged mortgage and the fake psychiatric evaluation sitting in the bank vault explained everything. They needed Josephine in their physical presence to push the next phase of their legal conspiracy forward. I kept my voice perfectly flat and accepted the invitation. I told her we would arrive at 7. After hanging up, I drove back to our modest house. Josephine was in the kitchen washing the soil from her hands with coarse soap. I sat her down at the wooden table and explained exactly what I had discovered at the bank. I watched the heartbreak wash over her face quickly, followed by the hardened resolve of a woman who had spent 4 decades protecting her family. I instructed her to remain completely silent during the dinner. She needed to act slightly disoriented, playing directly into the false dementia narrative they had fabricated. We arrived at Brandon and Victoria's upscale suburban home exactly on time. Brandon opened the door wearing a forced, rigid smile. He offered me a firm handshake, pretending the explosive confrontation in our driveway had never happened. Victoria emerged from the dining room holding a glass of wine and wearing a pristine white dress. She kissed Josephine on the cheek with practiced affection, guiding her toward the dining table as if she were a fragile, helpless child. I watched Victoria pull out a chair for my wife, noting the predatory gleam in my daughter-in-law's eyes. The trap was set, but they were entirely unaware of who was actually hunting whom. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Victoria served roasted lamb and poured expensive red wine, maintaining a steady stream of cheerful, meaningless conversation. She talked about her corporate success and her upcoming charity gala, carefully avoiding any mention of the botanical patents or Arthur Gallagher. Brandon sat across from me, nodding enthusiastically at his wife's stories while stealing nervous glances in my direction. Josephine played her role with absolute perfection. She kept her eyes focused on her plate, offering only vague, delayed responses when Victoria directly addressed her. Every time Josephine hesitated, Brandon and Victoria exchanged quick, triumphant looks. They firmly believed their fabricated narrative of her cognitive decline was becoming a reality. As soon as the dessert plates were cleared, Victoria shifted her posture. She adopted a tone of deep manufactured concern and folded her hands on the table. She announced that she and Brandon had been deeply worried about our long-term care. She reached into a leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents. She slid the papers smoothly across the mahogany table toward Josephine. Victoria explained that her corporate executive package included access to a premium elite health insurance network. She claimed she had pulled numerous strings to get Josephine added to the policy. All she needed was a simple signature on the enrollment forms to guarantee my wife the best medical care in the state. Brandon handed his mother a silver pen, his hand trembling slightly. Josephine looked at the pen, then looked at me, maintaining her silent facade. I reached across the table and took the stack of papers before my wife could touch them. Victoria immediately tensed, insisting the documents were standard medical releases that did not require my attention. I ignored her completely. I bypassed the heavily worded cover page and the misleading health benefit summaries, flipping directly to the final signature block. The bold legal heading at the top of the last page confirmed my exact suspicions. It was not an insurance enrollment form. It was a comprehensive medical power of attorney. The clauses explicitly granted Brandon absolute, irrevocable authority over all of Josephine's healthcare decisions, including the unilateral right to commit her to a locked psychiatric facility without my consent. They were attempting to trick my wife into legally signing her own freedom away. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the papers back in their faces or accuse them of their sickening betrayal. I simply aligned the edges of the heavy document, folded it neatly down the middle, and slid it directly into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. Victoria's forced smile vanished instantly. She shot out of her chair, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the dining table. She demanded that I leave the paperwork claiming the enrollment deadline expired at midnight and the forms contained confidential corporate information. Brandon stood up beside her, his voice rising in panic, insisting that I was overreacting and ruining a massive financial favor they were trying to do for us. I buttoned my jacket, securing the evidence against my chest. I looked directly into Victoria's terrified eyes and offered her a slow, freezing smile. I told her we deeply appreciated their sudden dedication to Josephine's medical future. I then informed her that I would be taking the documents directly to my private attorney, Evelyn Sinclair, for a thorough legal review first thing in the morning. I assured them that if the insurance policy was as generous as they claimed, Ms. Sinclair would gladly approve the signature by noon. The color completely drained from Victoria's face. She understood the immediate legal implications. A competent attorney would instantly recognize the fraudulent medical power of attorney and trace it back to her corporate notary. Her entire scheme was unraveling in real time. Brandon stepped forward, stammering a desperate excuse, trying to physically block my path to the hallway. I ignored him, placing my hand firmly on his shoulder and pushing him aside with the quiet, undeniable strength of a man who spent his life doing physical labor. I walked over to Josephine, gently pulled her chair back, and helped her to her feet. We walked toward the front door in total silence, leaving Brandon and Victoria standing paralyzed in their lavish dining room. As I turned the brass doorknob to leave, I glanced back one final time. Victoria was clutching her phone, her chest heaving with absolute, unadulterated panic. She knew her corporate theft, the forged mortgage, and the medical conspiracy were entirely exposed. I opened the door, escorted my wife out into the cool night air, and prepared to deliver the killing blow. The heavy glass doors of Evelyn Sinclair's law firm offered a stark contrast to the quiet morning air. I walked straight past the receptionist and entered Evelyn's private office before she had even finished her first cup of coffee. I did not offer any pleasantries. I reached into my jacket and placed the fabricated psychiatric evaluation, the forged commercial mortgage, and the predatory medical power of attorney flat on her polished mahogany desk. Evelyn picked up the papers. I watched her professional composure shatter as she processed the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. She read the forged signature of my wife. She analyzed the false medical claims verified by my own son. The silence in the room grew heavy as the reality of the crimes settled between us. Evelyn dropped the papers and reached immediately for her desk phone. She stated firmly that we needed to contact the district attorney and the financial crimes division right this second. She told me that Brandon and Victoria were looking at federal prison sentences for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. I placed my hand firmly over the receiver, pressing the phone back into its cradle. I looked directly into Evelyn's eyes and told her we were not calling the police. Law enforcement would simply lock them in a concrete cell and a trial would drag out for years. That was entirely insufficient for what they had attempted to do to Josephine. I wanted them to face a far more brutal reckoning. They had built their entire identities on arrogance, corporate status, and the illusion of superiority over the very people who funded their lives. I explained to Evelyn that before they faced a judge, they needed to lose absolutely everything they valued. They needed to watch their luxurious lifestyle evaporate into nothing. I wanted them stripped of their cars, their home, and their social standing. I wanted Victoria to face Arthur Gallagher with empty hands, and I wanted Brandon to realize that his perceived brilliance was a total fabrication. Evelyn slowly pulled her hand away from the telephone. She understood my strategy perfectly. She aligned the fraudulent documents on her desk, folded her hands, and asked me exactly how I wanted to begin the dismantling of my son's life. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a small, unassuming black ledger. I slid it across the desk toward Evelyn. This book contained the financial architecture of Brandon's entire adult existence. 5 years ago, when Brandon insisted he needed to maintain a high society image to succeed in the corporate world, I quietly set up a blind trust through a shell corporation. Every single month, I routed massive financial subsidies directly into his primary checking accounts. I paid the exorbitant property taxes on his sprawling suburban estate. I covered the extreme monthly leases for his luxury sports cars. I silently funded the country club memberships and the designer wardrobes that Victoria proudly flaunted on social media. Brandon firmly believed that his mediocre salary and intermittent commission checks were sustaining his lavish lifestyle. He considered himself a self-made financial genius. Victoria believed she had married a brilliant corporate strategist. Neither of them possessed the basic mathematical awareness to realize their outgoing expenses dwarfed their actual income by tens of thousands of dollars each month. My rough, calloused hands had anonymously paved the golden road they walked on. I instructed Evelyn to access the blind trust immediately. I ordered her to liquidate the holding accounts, sever the routing numbers, and initiate an absolute freeze on all outgoing transfers associated with Brandon's name. There would be no warning. There would be no gradual reduction in funds. I wanted the financial safety net eradicated completely and permanently. Evelyn turned to her computer terminal. Her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard as she accessed the secure banking portals. She navigated through the complex web of accounts I had established and executed the termination commands. The system processed the request, severing the 5-year financial lifeline in a matter of seconds. Brandon was now completely exposed to the crushing weight of his own massive debt. The illusion of his success was officially over. By tomorrow morning, every automated payment tied to his luxury lifestyle would bounce. I sat back in the leather guest chair, feeling a profound sense of closure. I was no longer funding my own disrespect. The silent adjustment was complete. The quiet atmosphere of the law office was suddenly shattered by the sharp, urgent ringing of Evelyn's private, secure phone line. She glanced at the caller ID, her brow furrowing in surprise, and put the call on speaker. It was the senior fraud investigator from the main bank branch where I had confiscated the original forged mortgage file just a few days prior. The investigator's voice was tense and rapid. He reported that Victoria was currently standing at a teller window in a downtown branch across the city. She was visibly panicked, acting erratic, and aggressively demanding an immediate unauthorized wire transfer. Victoria was attempting to forcefully move $3 million from the shell company holding the fraudulent mortgage funds directly into an untraceable offshore account. The reality of the situation clicked into place instantly. Victoria knew her timeline had collapsed. The moment I walked out of her dining room with the medical power of attorney, she realized her entire scheme was compromised. She knew I would show the documents to my lawyer, exposing her forged notary stamp. More importantly, Arthur Gallagher's massive corporate audit was scheduled to begin next week. The audit would inevitably uncover the millions she had embezzled through inflated landscaping invoices. Victoria was attempting to take the stolen equity from Josephine's land and flee the jurisdiction before the corporate and federal authorities could close the net around her. She was abandoning Brandon completely to save herself. Evelyn looked at me, her hand hovering over the keyboard, waiting for my authorization to instruct the bank. I leaned toward the speakerphone and issued a precise, calculated command. I told the investigator to let the teller stall her. I instructed them to flag the transfer request with a highly visible security hold, triggering an automatic system freeze on all accounts linked to her name. We were not going to let her run. We were going to trap her inside the very financial institution she had attempted to defraud. The investigator confirmed the instructions and disconnected the line. I stood up from the chair and straightened my tie. The chain of consequences had snapped tight. Victoria was locked in a cage of her own making, and the fallout was about to begin. Brandon adjusted his grip on the hand-stitched steering wheel of the imported sports car. He inhaled the sharp, distinct scent of pristine leather, a fragrance he firmly believed was his birthright. The luxury dealership floor was a cathedral of polished chrome and floor-to-ceiling glass designed specifically to cater to the elite. A senior salesman approached the driver's side window carrying a silver tray that held the final sales contract and a wireless payment terminal. Brandon casually reached into his designer wallet and dropped his exclusive black card onto the tray. It was the card tied directly to the blind trust he had always assumed was his own corporate expense account. The salesman smiled deferentially and inserted the chip. The terminal beeped a sharp negative tone. Brandon waved his hand dismissively, citing an overzealous banking security measure for large vehicle purchases, and pulled a platinum backup card from his wallet. The salesman ran it. The terminal rejected it instantly with a loud, abrasive buzz. A tight, deeply uncomfortable silence settled over the showroom floor. Brandon's arrogance faltered slightly as he retrieved his final card, a high-limit account he specifically reserved for international vacations. The salesman swiped it through the machine. The screen flashed a harsh red warning indicating an absolute account freeze. The salesman's obsequious smile vanished entirely. His posture straightened, shifting immediately from deferential to strictly professional. He looked down at Brandon, who was still sitting comfortably in the driver's seat of the $250,000 vehicle. The salesman stated with crystalline clarity that every single financial institution associated with Brandon's name had issued a hard denial. There was no security glitch. The accounts were entirely liquidated and locked. He extended his hand, pointing directly toward the showroom exit, and firmly requested that Brandon step out of the vehicle immediately. Brandon flushed a deep, humiliating shade of crimson. The other wealthy patrons in the showroom paused their conversations to watch the spectacle unfold. The illusion of his immense wealth shattered under the bright fluorescent lights. He grabbed his rejected plastic cards, shoved the heavy car door open, and stumbled out onto the polished tile stripped of his manufactured dignity in front of a captivated audience. Brandon practically ran out of the glass showroom, seeking immediate refuge in the driver's seat of his heavily financed daily commuter car. His hands shook violently as he pulled out his phone and dialed the premium client service number printed on the back of his rejected black card. He demanded an immediate explanation from the representative, fully expecting to shout down a junior bank teller for a severe clerical error. The voice on the other end of the line remained entirely calm and detached. The representative informed Brandon that he was not the primary account holder. He was merely an authorized user on a blind trust managed by an external shell corporation. The representative stated that the primary guarantor had executed a total liquidation directive at exactly 8 o'clock that morning. Every single credit line, automated payment, and liquid asset tied to that trust had been permanently revoked. Brandon dropped the phone into his lap. The realization hit him with the physical force of a sledgehammer. His entire corporate identity, the lavish estate, the European vacations, and the country club memberships had never been funded by his own success. His father had been silently paying for his arrogance for 5 years. The immense gratitude he should have felt was instantly eclipsed by a venomous, explosive rage. His father had the power to sever his lifeline with a single phone call, and he had done it without warning, leaving Brandon humiliated in public. Brandon gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white against the dark interior. He threw his car into gear and sped out of the dealership parking lot, running a red light as he merged onto the highway. He drove recklessly through the mid-morning traffic, heading straight for our quiet suburban neighborhood. He tore down our street in broad daylight, his tires mounting the curb as he swerved aggressively into our driveway. He left his car door wide open and marched up the concrete walkway. He bypassed the doorbell entirely, balling his hands into tight fists. He began to pound furiously on the heavy wooden front door, his blows echoing loudly through the quiet, peaceful neighborhood. He screamed my name, demanding that I open the door and face him. I stood quietly in this hallway, listening to the frantic, heavy blows raining down on my front door. I checked the screen of my smartphone, ensuring the voice recording application was actively running. I slipped the device into the breast pocket of my shirt, leaving the microphone perfectly positioned to capture every sound. I reached forward and pulled the door open. Brandon nearly fell across the threshold, his fist raised in the air for another violent strike. His face was a mask of unhinged desperation. He did not ask for an explanation. He did not express an ounce of remorse for his actions. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest and demanded that I reactivate the trust accounts immediately. I looked at him with complete detachment, offering absolutely no emotional reaction to his hysteria. My silence pushed him entirely over the edge. Brandon stepped closer, his voice rising to a frantic scream that carried clearly across the manicured lawns of my neighbors. He stated that if I did not restore his access to the money by the end of the day, he would execute the medical power of attorney. He proudly announced that he had a signed, notarized psychiatric evaluation proving his mother was suffering from severe dementia. He threatened to drag Josephine out of her own home, have a judge declare her legally incompetent, and lock her inside a state-run nursing facility for the rest of her life. He explicitly stated that he would use his legal authority to liquidate her botanical patents and sell the generational farmland out from under us to fund his lifestyle. He promised to destroy his own mother's freedom if I did not submit to his financial demands. He stood there, his chest heaving, waiting for me to surrender to his ultimate threat. I looked at the man who shared my last name. He had just handed me the final irrefutable piece of evidence I needed to guarantee his incarceration. I smiled coldly, a look devoid of any parental warmth. I told him his timeline was incredibly ambitious. I calmly reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped the screen to stop the recording. I held the device up, letting him see the saved audio file displaying the exact length of his extortion attempt. The arrogant fury drained from Brandon's face, instantly replaced by absolute paralyzing terror. The morning sun broke through the kitchen blinds, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I sat at the table with a mug of black coffee, enjoying the profound stillness of the house. The frantic, unhinged energy Brandon had brought to our driveway the previous afternoon felt like a distant, chaotic memory. I knew his silence this morning was not a surrender. It was the calm before a desperate, highly calculated retaliation. My son and his wife were backed into a corner, financially suffocated and legally exposed. People who construct their entire lives on a foundation of lies do not simply apologize when they are caught. They double down. At exactly 9 o'clock, the sharp, authoritative chime of the doorbell shattered the quiet morning. I placed my mug on the counter and walked to the entryway. Standing on my front porch was a stern-looking woman in a tailored gray suit clutching a thick leather clipboard. A uniformed city police officer stood 2 paces behind her, his hands resting casually near his utility belt. I opened the door fully, my posture relaxed but vigilant. The woman held up a federal identification badge. She introduced herself as Agent Sylvia Davis from Adult Protective Services. She stated that she was conducting a mandatory wellness check based on a high-priority anonymous tip received late last night. I did not act surprised or offended. I stepped aside and invited them both into the foyer. Agent Davis stepped over the threshold, her eyes immediately scanning the pristine, quiet interior of our home. She opened her clipboard and read from the intake form in a clipped professional tone. The anonymous caller had filed a severe claim of elder abuse. The report alleged that I was physically mistreating Josephine, keeping her isolated, and forcing her into intense manual labor despite a rapidly declining mental state. The caller explicitly cited Josephine's heavily calloused, bruised, and soil-stained hands as direct, undeniable proof of physical neglect and forced servitude. Victoria had played her next card. Brandon's attempted extortion had failed, so his wife had weaponized the state apparatus. She had deliberately twisted Josephine's lifelong dedication to her craft into a fabricated narrative of domestic torture. She hoped the police would drag me out of my own home in handcuffs, leaving Josephine entirely vulnerable to their fraudulent medical power of attorney. I did not raise my voice, nor did I demand to know the identity of her anonymous informant. I offered Agent Davis a polite, reassuring smile. I told her that I completely understood her obligation to investigate such serious claims, and that I would be happy to provide full transparency. I asked her and the officer to follow me through the house toward the backyard. I led them out the rear patio doors and guided them down a paved stone walkway. At the far end of our property stood a massive structure of reinforced steel and tempered glass. It was not a simple backyard garden shed. It was a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled $2 million botanical research facility. I pulled a heavy ring of keys from my pocket, unlocked the commercial-grade deadbolt, and pushed the heavy doors open. The blast of warm, humid air washed over us, carrying the sharp scent of organic compounds and blooming hybrid flora. Agent Davis and the police officer stepped inside, their professional stoicism instantly evaporating into sheer, undisguised awe. Rows of high-tech hydroponic drip systems hummed softly. Elaborate chemical mixing stations lined the stainless steel workbenches. At the center of the facility, Josephine was standing under a bank of full-spectrum grow lights. She wore a pristine white canvas lab coat over her clothes, wearing thick protective goggles as she carefully grafted a thorny experimental rose stem onto a host root. I called her name gently. Josephine placed her scalpel down, removed her goggles, and walked over to us with sharp, undeniable lucidity. I introduced her to the authorities. Josephine greeted them warmly, shaking the agent's hand with her rough, calloused grip. With effortless intellectual precision, my wife explained her 40 years of genetic crossbreeding. She detailed the corrosive nature of the experimental soil modifiers she formulated and the physical toll of handling hundreds of aggressive hybrid thorns every single week. She pointed to the framed federal botanical patents hanging proudly on the office wall. Agent Davis looked from the multi-million-dollar equipment to the highly educated, perfectly coherent woman standing before her. The realization hit the agent like a physical blow. The anonymous tip was an absolute fabrication. She recognized instantly that her department's resources had been maliciously manipulated to harass a wealthy, highly capable professional. Agent Davis closed her leather clipboard, her face flushing with a deep visible embarrassment. She apologized profusely to both of us, stating that family disputes frequently triggered these types of false, weaponized reports. The police officer nodded in agreement, relaxing his posture completely. I accepted her apology, graciously assuring her that we held no ill will against her department for simply doing their job. Before she could turn to leave, I smoothly changed my tone to one of protective legal concern. I requested a physical copy of the intake report. I explained that my private attorney was currently compiling an injunction against a family member who was actively attempting to defraud our estate. I framed the document as a necessary piece of evidence to stop the ongoing harassment. Bound by the obvious falsehood of the situation, Agent Davis complied. She pulled the printed email submission from her file, handed it to me, and escorted the officer off my property. I locked the greenhouse doors and walked back into my kitchen. I sat down at the table and placed the document flat on the wood. I completely ignored the vicious fabricated paragraphs detailing my supposed domestic crimes. I focused my eyes entirely on the top margin of the paper. I read the tiny digitized print containing the automated routing data, the timestamp, and the metadata of the email submission. Victoria possessed a lethal combination of extreme arrogance and profound technical ignorance. She genuinely believed that submitting a form through an anonymous online portal rendered her completely invisible. She failed to realize that automated intake systems log the exact IP address and the outgoing mail server domain of the sender. The header printed across the top of the page was crystal clear. Victoria had not sent the false police report from her personal phone or her home network. She had used her secure corporate desktop. The domain explicitly belonged to the executive network of Arthur Gallagher's eco-resort development firm. She had drafted a fraudulent government document, committed perjury, and initiated a false police investigation using the private monitored servers of a billionaire. I tapped my finger against the paper, a cold, ruthless smile spreading across my face. I possessed the absolute proof of her corporate misconduct. I did not need to fight Victoria in a prolonged legal battle. I simply needed to make a single phone call to Arthur Gallagher and hand him the weapon to destroy her career permanently. I sat at my kitchen table long after Agent Davis drove away. The printed email with Arthur Gallagher's corporate domain staring back at me was the final confirmation of Victoria's absolute recklessness. She had weaponized her employer's secure network to file a fraudulent police report against me. I knew then that her arrogance had severely compromised her intelligence. I needed a professional to dissect her entire financial existence. I picked up my phone and called Evelyn Sinclair. I instructed my lawyer to bypass standard private investigators and immediately hire the most ruthless forensic accountant in the city. By noon, I was sitting across a polished steel desk from Marcus Vance. Marcus was a former federal auditor who specialized in dismantling high-level corporate fraud. I handed him the physical file containing Brandon's recently terminated blind trust, the forged commercial mortgage documents, and the metadata from the false abuse report. I explained my exact objective. I did not want simple surveillance. I wanted a complete, impenetrable map of every single dollar Victoria had touched over the past 5 years. I knew precisely how much money I had secretly funneled into Brandon's accounts to subsidize their lifestyle. However, even with my massive monthly deposits, Victoria's extravagant spending habits had always mathematically exceeded their available capital. She drove imported luxury vehicles, wore bespoke designer clothing, and hosted lavish charity galas that cost tens of thousands of dollars to cater. Brandon's mediocre mid-level salary combined with my anonymous trust fund simply could not cover that extreme level of financial hemorrhaging. There was an unaccounted river of cash flowing into their household, and I needed Marcus to find the exact source. Marcus reviewed the forged loan documents, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the shell corporation registered under Brandon's name. He noted the corporate notary stamp Victoria had illegally utilized. He looked up at me with the cold, calculating expression of a predator sensing blood in the water. He assured me that people who fake federal banking signatures always leave a digital footprint of their prior crimes. He promised to deliver a comprehensive financial autopsy within 48 hours. I left his office and drove back to my wife, feeling a deep, resolute calm. The emotional grief of losing a son was completely gone. I was entirely focused on the systematic eradication of his fabricated empire. Marcus did not need 48 hours. He called me exactly 26 hours later and requested my immediate presence at his office. When I walked through his door, he had a massive schematic pinned to a whiteboard connecting dozens of banking transit numbers with bright red lines. Marcus gestured to the board, explaining the sheer audacity of Victoria's embezzlement scheme. She had not simply skimmed off the top of her corporate expense accounts. She had orchestrated a systematic multi-million-dollar theft directly from Arthur Gallagher's eco-resort development firm. Victoria served as a senior procurement executive, giving her unilateral authority to approve vendor contracts for the massive landscaping and botanical installations at Gallagher's global resorts. Marcus traced a red marker from Gallagher's corporate accounts directly to the shell company registered in Brandon's name. For the past 3 years, Victoria had been aggressively inflating the invoices for exotic plant shipments and specialized soil modifiers. She would authorize payments to legitimate vendors for a fraction of the cost and seamlessly route the massive overcharges into Brandon's ghost corporation. The bitter irony was not lost on me. Victoria had built her entire fraudulent fortune by exploiting the exact same botanical supply chain that my wife had legitimately mastered. She had spent years mocking Josephine for having dirt under her fingernails, all while secretly stealing millions of dollars disguised as landscaping expenses. Brandon was entirely complicit. The shell company required his authentic signature to establish the routing numbers. He had allowed his wife to turn his legal identity into a sophisticated money laundering operation. They had used the stolen corporate funds to bridge the massive gap between my anonymous trust deposits and their insatiable greed. They bought their sprawling suburban estate and funded their luxury vacations using Arthur Gallagher's stolen capital. Marcus handed me a thick binder containing hundreds of falsified invoices, bank routing confirmations, and offshore transfer receipts. The evidence was irrefutable. Victoria had embezzled nearly $4 million from a notoriously ruthless billionaire. She had operated with absolute impunity, firmly believing her position insulated her from any real scrutiny. But Marcus had uncovered a fatal flaw in her timeline. He pointed to a sharp, sudden halt in the illegal transfers occurring exactly 3 weeks ago. I stared at the sudden gap in the financial timeline, mentally aligning it with Brandon and Victoria's recent frantic behavior. I asked Marcus what had triggered the abrupt stop in the embezzlement. Marcus pulled a corporate press release from his desk and slid it toward me. Arthur Gallagher had recently retained a merciless independent auditing firm to conduct a comprehensive company-wide financial review of all executive procurement divisions. The audit was scheduled to begin its deep forensic dive into Victoria's specific department next Monday morning. The puzzle pieces locked together with devastating clarity. Victoria had panicked. The upcoming audit would instantly detect the inflated landscaping invoices and trace the missing $4 million directly to Brandon's shell company. She needed a massive, immediate injection of liquid cash to quietly replace the stolen funds before the auditors arrived. Their lavish lifestyle had completely drained their available capital, and my sudden termination of Brandon's blind trust had removed their only safety net. They were trapped. They could not secure a legitimate commercial loan because their true income could not support the debt-to-income ratio. Desperation had bred profound stupidity. In a frantic bid to save herself from federal prison, Victoria had targeted the only unencumbered high-value asset she could find. She had forged Josephine's signature to leverage my wife's 50 acres of prime agricultural farmland. They planned to use the bank's loan payout to secretly replace Gallagher's missing millions, entirely destroying my wife's legacy to cover their corporate theft. The fraudulent medical power of attorney they tried to force upon us at dinner was their ultimate insurance policy. If Josephine discovered the massive lien against her property, Brandon would use the fake dementia diagnosis to declare her legally incompetent. He would lock his own mother in a psychiatric ward to ensure her silence and protect his wife from an embezzlement conviction. I closed the thick binder of financial evidence and held it firmly against my chest. My son and his wife had attempted to execute a flawless sociopathic survival strategy. Instead, they had handed me the exact weapon I needed to annihilate them. I thanked Marcus for his exceptional work and walked out of the building. I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled through my contacts until I found the private business card Arthur Gallagher had handed me at the restaurant. It was time to make a phone call. The massive iron gates of the Gallagher estate swung open, allowing a steady stream of luxury vehicles to proceed up the winding, illuminated driveway. The annual Botanical Charity Gala was the crown jewel of the city's corporate social calendar. For Victoria, tonight was the absolute culmination of her 5-year strategic plan. She was officially directing the entire event, positioning herself at the center of the elite networking circle. She had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously controlling every detail, from the imported floral arrangements to the seating chart of the VIP tables. She firmly believed that a flawless execution tonight would guarantee her promotion to Senior Vice President of Procurement. She stood near the entrance of the grand ballroom, wearing a sheer floor-length silver gown that was entirely financed by her embezzlement scheme. She greeted the arriving executives with practiced charm, her corporate smile masking the profound panic that had consumed her since our disastrous dinner. She had spent the last 48 hours frantically attempting to move stolen funds through blocked offshore accounts, entirely unaware that the net had already closed. She believed that if she could simply secure her promotion tonight, the resulting increase in corporate authority would allow her to bury the fraudulent invoices before the audit began on Monday morning. Her survival strategy relied entirely on maintaining absolute control over the narrative and keeping any dissenting voices far away from Arthur Gallagher. Josephine and I arrived at the estate precisely 45 minutes after the doors opened. We did not arrive in my 10-year-old truck. We arrived in a chauffeured town car provided specifically by the host. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo tailored to the exact specifications I had worn decades ago. I turned and offered my hand to my wife. Josephine emerged from the car radiating an undeniable quiet authority. She wore a deep emerald velvet gown that moved flawlessly as she walked, but the true statement rested against her skin. She wore the generational diamond and pearl necklace I had retrieved from our secure bank vault that afternoon. The necklace was an antique, flawless piece of jewelry that possessed a market value significantly higher than the entire mortgage balance Brandon had forged on her land. It was a physical, irrefutable manifestation of the wealth Victoria believed she was entitled to steal. We walked past the valet attendants and approached the primary security checkpoint. The head of security, a large man with an earpiece, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the guest list on his tablet. He asked for our names with a polite but firm tone. I did not provide my name. I simply handed him the heavy gold-embossed envelope we had received by private courier that morning. He opened the flap and pulled out 2 VIP diamond invitations. These invitations were entirely distinct from the standard entry tickets. They were issued exclusively by Arthur Gallagher and granted immediate unrestricted access to the private executive tier of the ballroom. The security guard glanced at the signature, immediately recognized the billionaire's personal seal, and stepped aside with a deep, respectful bow. We walked through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the dazzling light of the gala. The atmosphere was charged with the low hum of expensive conversations and the clinking of crystal. We moved smoothly through the crowd, heading directly toward the massive, tiered champagne fountain positioned at the center of the room. We did not hide. We stood in the brightest section of the ballroom, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Victoria spotted us from across the room. I watched the progression of recognition, shock, and absolute terror wash over her face. Her confident corporate posture shattered instantly. The silver gown seemed to lose its luster as she stared at the diamond and pearl necklace resting against Josephine's chest. She understood the immediate catastrophic implication of our presence. She knew I possessed the fraudulent medical power of attorney. She knew I had access to the forged commercial mortgage. And she believed with absolute certainty that we had crashed her event to publicly humiliate her in front of the exact executives she needed to impress. Her survival instinct overrode any remaining shred of rationality. She could not allow us to speak to anyone, especially Arthur Gallagher. Victoria abandoned her position at the entrance and rushed toward the perimeter of the room, intercepting 2 private security guards. She pointed a trembling finger in our direction, her face flushed with frantic desperation. She engaged the guards in a rapid, hushed conversation, claiming we were uninvited intruders who were actively harassing the VIP guests. She explicitly ordered them to physically remove us from the premises immediately, using whatever force was necessary to prevent a public scene. The guards nodded, their expressions hardening into professional hostility. They adjusted their earpieces and began moving aggressively through the crowd, charting a direct intercept course toward the champagne fountain. Victoria stood near the edge of the dance floor, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching with a tense, breathless anticipation. She firmly believed she was minutes away from eliminating the threat and securing her promotion. I watched the guards approaching from my peripheral vision. I did not move. I simply reached into my tuxedo pocket, felt the smooth surface of Arthur Gallagher's private business card, and smiled. The 2 private security guards closed the distance with predatory efficiency. The larger of the 2 reached out and clamped a heavy hand directly onto my right shoulder, applying immediate physical pressure to force me toward the service exit. I did not resist, nor did I raise my voice to protest the physical escalation. I simply raised my right hand, holding Arthur Gallagher's private gold-embossed business card directly in the guard's line of sight. The guard blinked, recognizing the billionaire's personal watermark, and his grip faltered for a fraction of a second. Before he could decide whether to follow Victoria's frantic orders or respect the host's insignia, a sharp, commanding voice sliced through the elegant murmur of the ballroom. Arthur Gallagher was standing on the sweeping marble staircase leading down from the mezzanine. His sharp eyes had tracked the commotion, and his expression was a mask of absolute corporate fury. He descended the stairs with rapid, heavy strides, the wealthy crowd instinctively parting to grant him a clear, unobstructed path. He marched directly up to the security guards. Gallagher did not ask for an explanation or seek context from his employees. He looked at the heavy hand resting on my tailored shoulder and issued a cold, devastating directive. He ordered the guards to step away from his most esteemed guests immediately. The head guard attempted to stammer a weak excuse, citing Victoria's direct, urgent orders to remove uninvited disruptors from the VIP floor. Gallagher cut him off with a single sharp gesture. He stated with absolute finality that any security personnel incapable of recognizing the true guests of honor had no place in his employment. He fired both men on the spot, demanding they hand over their earpieces and exit the property through the service doors immediately. The immediate vicinity fell into a stunned, breathless silence as the 2 men retreated. Victoria's primary line of defense evaporated in front of the entire corporate hierarchy. She stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, completely stripped of her perceived authority and utterly defenseless against the unfolding reality. Arthur Gallagher turned his back on the retreating guards and faced Josephine. The severe, intimidating aura of the billionaire vanished, replaced instantly by a profound, deferential respect. He took my wife's rough, calloused hand in his and bowed his head slightly in greeting. His voice carried effortlessly across the silent ballroom as he delivered a profound public apology for the inexcusable breach of hospitality. He addressed Josephine not as a subordinate or a simple guest, but as a peer of immense value. Gallagher loudly declared to the surrounding executives that Josephine was the brilliant architectural mind behind the botanical preservation efforts at his flagship eco-resort. He praised her 40 years of scientific dedication and explicitly stated that her presence tonight was the absolute highlight of his evening. The surrounding corporate elite, the very people Victoria had spent months manipulating and trying to impress, immediately murmured in agreement. They shifted their entire focus and admiration toward my wife, eager to align themselves with the billionaire's favored guest. Victoria's meticulously crafted illusion of superiority shattered completely. The promotion she had lied, manipulated, and embezzled to secure dissolved into nothing as her billionaire boss publicly venerated the woman she had mercilessly mocked and attempted to destroy. The humiliation was absolute, highly public, and inescapable. Her face flushed a mottled, furious shade of crimson. She could not endure the catastrophic collapse of her social and professional standing for another second. She pivoted sharply on her silver heels, marched directly toward Brandon, and grabbed his arm with vicious, unyielding force. She dragged her husband away from the champagne fountain, pushing roughly through the crowd and disappearing behind a pair of heavy mahogany doors leading to a private service hallway. I excused myself from Gallagher's company with a polite nod, leaving Josephine to bask in her well-deserved recognition among the city's elite. I walked purposefully toward the mahogany doors, slipping quietly into the secluded corridor. Victoria was pacing like a caged animal, hissing venomous accusations at Brandon. She blamed him entirely for the public disaster, demanding to know why he had failed to control his parents, and demanding he fix the situation before she lost her career entirely. I stepped out of the shadows and walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway. Victoria stopped her frantic pacing mid-stride, her mouth snapping shut as she saw me approach. Brandon turned his face, a mixture of lingering arrogance and rapidly rising panic. I did not offer any pleasantries or acknowledge Victoria's fury. I reached inside my tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a slim, condensed version of the forensic audit file Marcus Vance had prepared for me. I handed the black folder directly to Brandon. I instructed him to look at the documents that detailed the exact financial architecture of his impending federal indictment. Brandon flipped the folder open. His eyes darted across the pages, absorbing the undeniable mathematical reality of his crimes. He saw the highlighted routing numbers linking Arthur Gallagher's corporate accounts directly to his personal shell company. He saw the meticulously documented trail of $4 million in stolen funds, completely dismantling Victoria's sophisticated embezzlement scheme in black and white. Victoria looked over his shoulder, her breath catching in her throat as she realized her corporate execution was contained within those pages. The silence in the hallway was thick and suffocating. Brandon closed the folder. The panic in his eyes briefly gave way to the reckless, cornered desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. He knew I was holding the exact weapon needed to destroy their lives permanently. He stepped toward me, attempting to leverage a power he no longer possessed. He sneered, stating that if I handed that audit to Gallagher, he would retaliate with a scorched earth financial maneuver. Brandon revealed that the blind trust I had funded also contained a minority block of shares in a highly lucrative agricultural logistics firm, a company Gallagher desperately needed to acquire to complete his upcoming merger. Brandon threatened to immediately sell his voting shares to Gallagher's fiercest corporate rival. He claimed the resulting corporate sabotage would cost the billionaire hundreds of millions of dollars, ensuring that Gallagher would direct his boundless destructive wrath at all of us. Brandon stood tall, gripping the folder, fully believing his threat of mutual assured destruction would force my immediate surrender. Brandon stood tall, breathing heavily, waiting for me to panic. I looked at his desperate, defiant face and felt a sound build deep within my chest. I laughed. It was not a brief chuckle or a dismissive scoff, but a genuine resonant laugh that echoed sharply off the polished mahogany panels of the private corridor. Brandon flinched, the sound completely shattering his fragile facade of control. His grip on the audit folder faltered as his manufactured confidence evaporated. I stepped forward, closing the distance until I was standing mere inches from him. I told him his ignorance of basic corporate law was matched only by his staggering arrogance. I explained that a blind trust designed to protect family assets from predatory external forces would never grant a 20-something junior executive unilateral voting power over multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions. I asked him if he honestly believed I would hand him the absolute keys to an agricultural logistics empire simply because he demanded a high society lifestyle to impress his peers. I watched his eyes widen as the foundational premise of his ultimate threat began to crumble beneath him. He stammered, his voice pitching higher as he insisted that his name was explicitly printed on the quarterly trust reports. He claimed he had seen the shareholder distributions with his own eyes and signed the tax documents verifying his ownership. I nodded slowly, confirming that his name was indeed heavily featured on the paperwork. I then clarified the critical legal distinction that separated his illusion of power from my absolute legal control. I told him he held exactly 0 voting shares. He was completely legally incapable of selling, transferring, leveraging, or weaponizing a single asset within that portfolio. He could not sell shares to Arthur Gallagher's rival because he did not own the shares. He was a phantom owner, holding an empty title, wielding a plastic sword in a room full of corporate artillery. I reached out and tapped the heavy black folder he was clutching against his chest. I advised him to think back to the specific documents he rushed to sign 5 years ago in Evelyn Sinclair's law office. He had been so entirely focused on the massive monthly cash flow heading into his checking accounts that he never bothered to read the legal stipulations attached to the capital. I explained that he had merely signed dividend beneficiary certificates. Those documents granted him the right to receive the passive income generated by the trust, nothing more. He was essentially a dependent collecting a vast allowance legally prohibited from touching the principal capital or making any executive decisions regarding the corporate structure. The blood drained entirely from Brandon's face as the crushing reality of his financial impotence settled over him. He opened his mouth to argue, searching for any possible loophole, but I cut him off with a sharp, unforgiving tone. I informed him that those beneficiary certificates contained a strict morality clause. It was a standard legal mechanism designed to protect the trust from criminal exposure and reputational damage. I told him that his violent behavior in my driveway yesterday morning, specifically his recorded attempt to extort money using a fraudulent dementia diagnosis, triggered the immediate revocation protocol. Evelyn Sinclair had filed the termination paperwork the moment the family courts opened today. I watched my son process the totality of his absolute ruin. The phantom shares were gone. The massive monthly deposits were gone. Victoria's stolen millions were fully documented and ready for federal prosecution. I leaned in and delivered the final, devastating blow. I told him he possessed absolutely nothing. He was standing in a borrowed tuxedo in a billionaire's private hallway, utterly broke, legally exposed, and completely stripped of the manufactured identity he had worshipped for years. The heavy silence in the corridor was suddenly broken by the sharp, distinct sound of a silver stiletto heel scraping against the polished hardwood floor. I shifted my gaze past Brandon's shoulder toward the recessed alcove near the service exit. Victoria was standing half hidden in the shadows. She had followed us from the main ballroom, undoubtedly intending to watch Brandon leverage his supposed corporate shares to force my compliance and save her career. Instead, she had just witnessed the absolute dismantling of her husband's wealth and power. I watched her perfectly contoured face contort into a mask of pure self-preserving calculation. She looked at Brandon, who was staring blankly at the folder in his hands, entirely paralyzed by his sudden financial annihilation. She did not rush forward to comfort him. She did not stand by her partner to face the impending fallout of their joint embezzlement scheme. Victoria analyzed the situation with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. Brandon was no longer a shield. He was a sinking anchor strapped directly to a massive federal indictment. She understood clearly that remaining by his side meant facing Arthur Gallagher's immediate wrath and guaranteed prison time for corporate theft. She made her decision instantly. Victoria took a silent step backward, retreating further into the dim lighting of the service alcove. She turned away from her husband of 5 years without uttering a single word of farewell or offering a glance of regret. I watched the glimmer of her silver gown disappear as she pushed open the heavy brass handle of the rear fire exit, slipping out into the cold night air. She was abandoning her marriage, her lucrative career, and her entire fabricated life to save herself from the consequences of her own greed. I looked back at Brandon. He was completely unaware that his wife had just deserted him in his darkest moment. He stood utterly alone in the quiet hallway, holding the comprehensive proof of his own destruction, staring into a future devoid of everything he had ever valued. Monday morning arrived with the bleak, unforgiving light of consequence. Victoria sat rigidly in the plush leather chair of a private offshore banking branch located on the extreme edge of the financial district. She had spent the entire weekend living out of a rented hotel room under her maiden name, completely disconnected from Brandon and the shattered remnants of their suburban life. She had abandoned her husband without a second thought, viewing him as nothing more than a liability the moment his financial impotence was exposed in the hallway of the gala. The annual corporate audit at Arthur Gallagher's eco-resort firm had officially commenced exactly 1 hour ago. She knew the team of ruthless independent auditors were already tearing through her procurement division, scrutinizing the inflated landscaping invoices she had meticulously fabricated over the years. Her window for survival was closing by the second, but she remained confident in her own superiority. She placed her heavy designer handbag on the polished glass desk and withdrew a thick stack of manila folders. She presented the corporate routing numbers for the shell company registered under Brandon's name alongside a series of pre-signed authorization forms she had forced her husband to endorse months ago. She looked across the desk at the senior wire transfer specialist, forcing her features into a flawless mask of bored aristocratic impatience. She instructed the specialist to execute an immediate total liquidation of the shell company's assets. She ordered him to route the remaining $3 million directly into a series of untraceable accounts situated in the Cayman Islands. She claimed it was a highly sensitive corporate acquisition demanding the funds be released and cleared before noon. Her manicured hands remained perfectly still on her lap, completely hiding the frantic adrenaline-fueled terror coursing through her veins. She had already calculated the flight schedules. Once the wire cleared, she intended to walk directly out of the bank, board a private charter, and vanish across international borders permanently. She watched the specialist take the folders, open his secure terminal, and begin inputting the routing digits. The gentle tapping of his keyboard sounded like a countdown. Victoria took a slow, measured breath, absolutely convinced her ruthless pragmatism had saved her from the wreckage I had caused. The specialist hit the final execution key and waited for the global banking server to authenticate the massive international transfer. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed intently on the reflection of the computer monitor. A heavy, absolute silence stretched across the private office. The specialist frowned, his brow furrowing as a solid red dialog box consumed his screen. He pressed the override command, assuming a standard security hold for a transaction of this magnitude. The system emitted a harsh, singular rejection tone. The specialist pulled his hands away from the keyboard and looked at Victoria, his professional, accommodating demeanor instantly replaced by cold, institutional suspicion. He informed her that the transaction was entirely locked. Victoria immediately flared with manufactured corporate outrage. She threatened to close all her accounts, ruin his career, and have him fired for incompetence if he did not process the wire immediately. She demanded he call the branch manager and manually force the money through the server. The specialist did not flinch, nor did he reach for his telephone. He simply turned the monitor around so Victoria could read the federal warning spanning the screen. He stated with absolute clarity that no manager on Earth could override this specific blockade. Evelyn Sinclair had filed a preemptive federal injunction the exact moment the courts opened this morning. Acting on my direct instructions and armed with Marcus Vance's comprehensive forensic audit, my attorney had submitted an emergency asset freeze to the Financial Crimes Division. The injunction explicitly cited the shell company as an active conduit for corporate embezzlement and high-level money laundering. Every single penny Victoria attempted to steal was now under a hard federal lock pending a full criminal investigation. Victoria stared at the red text on the monitor, the blood draining completely from her face. The reality of the blockade crushed her lungs, suffocating her desperate escape plan. I had not just stripped Brandon of his fake empire. I had anticipated her exact escape route, understood her predictable psychology, and severed her lifeline before she could even reach the door. The $3 million she desperately needed to disappear was permanently legally out of her reach. Victoria lunged forward and grabbed her folders, desperate to flee the office before the situation escalated any further. She shoved the useless documents into her bag, intending to abandon the frozen money entirely and run with whatever cash she had on hand. Before she could stand up, the specialist's desk phone began to ring with a piercing, urgent tone. He picked up the receiver, listened for 5 seconds, and locked his eyes directly onto Victoria. He did not break eye contact as he reached underneath his desk and pressed a silent security button. He informed Victoria that she was not permitted to leave the building. The federal injunction carried an automated high-level tracing protocol designed specifically to catch embezzlers in the act of fleeing. The moment she attempted to wire the frozen funds, the banking system triggered a massive, unavoidable security alert. That alert did not simply bounce back to the local branch or disappear into a bureaucratic void. Because the frozen assets were directly tied to the corporate routing numbers of Arthur Gallagher's eco-resort firm, the system automatically notified the origin point of the stolen capital. The specialist stated that Arthur Gallagher's corporate fraud division had just received a real-time notification of her exact location and her brazen attempt to liquidate the stolen assets. Victoria stumbled backward, her hip hitting the sharp edge of the glass desk. The pristine corporate illusion she had maintained for 5 years evaporated in a fraction of a second. She was no longer a powerful senior executive demanding respect. She was a trapped, exposed criminal standing in the center of a locked financial institution. The independent auditors at Gallagher's firm now had the definitive, indisputable proof they needed delivered directly to their screens by Victoria's own panicked actions. The heavy security doors of the private bank branch clicked audibly as the electronic deadbolts engaged, sealing her inside the lobby. She dropped her designer handbag to the floor, her hands trembling violently as she finally realized the sheer magnitude of her failure. There was no private charter waiting for her on the tarmac. There was no offshore sanctuary to hide her crimes. She had walked willingly into the exact trap I had built for her, and the billionaire she had stolen from was already sending his corporate security team to collect her. The phone on my kitchen island buzzed just past midnight. The caller ID displayed Brandon's name. I let it ring 3 times before sliding the answer icon. I did not offer a greeting. On the other end of the line, a fractured, gasping sob filled the silence. It was the sound of a man watching his manufactured reality burn to ash. Brandon's voice cracked as he confessed the absolute wreckage of his evening. He had returned to their sprawling suburban estate to find the master bedroom completely ransacked. Victoria had not waited for him to return from the gala. She had stripped the closets bare, emptied the wall safe of her jewelry, and vanished. She had packed her bags and abandoned him the moment she realized his financial utility had expired. The desperation in his voice was thick and suffocating. He wept openly, abandoning the polished corporate persona he had so carefully cultivated for years. He told me that his credit cards were permanently declined, his bank accounts were frozen, and the collection agencies were already calling his personal cell phone. He was facing immediate, catastrophic bankruptcy. He begged me to help him. He pleaded for a financial lifeline, claiming he had been manipulated by Victoria and that he was completely unaware of the sheer magnitude of her embezzlement. He begged me to release a fraction of the blind trust, just enough to hire a defense attorney and secure a modest apartment. He leaned entirely on the residual guilt he assumed I harbored as a parent. He expected me to instinctively shield him from the harsh, unforgiving consequences of his own arrogance. He sobbed into the receiver, asking his father to bail him out one last definitive time. He promised to change. He promised to repay every single cent. He swore that if I just authorized the release of the funds, he would respect the boundaries I set. I listened to his frantic pleading, analyzing the hollow architecture of his remorse. He was not apologizing for forging his mother's signature or attempting to lock her in a psychiatric ward. He was apologizing because he had lost his money, his wife, and his power in a single devastating stroke. I allowed his panicked apologies to echo into the quiet space of my kitchen before I finally spoke. I kept my voice entirely devoid of emotion. There was no anger, no pity, and absolutely no parental warmth. I simply stated his name, cutting through his hysteria with surgical precision. I told him that I heard his request. I did not validate his excuses regarding Victoria's manipulation, nor did I acknowledge his promises of future repayment. I maintained a strict business-like tone. I instructed Brandon to find his wife. I did not care what lies he had to tell her, or what promises he had to make to drag her out of hiding. I made it absolutely clear that my offer was contingent upon her physical presence. I told him that if he wanted a financial bailout, he needed to bring Victoria to Evelyn Sinclair's law office at exactly 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. I explicitly used the phrase, "final settlement papers." I explained that Evelyn had drafted a comprehensive legal agreement. The documents would formally dissolve the previous blind trust and establish a new, heavily restricted line of credit designed to cover their immediate legal fees and outstanding residential debts. I told him this new arrangement required both of their notarized signatures to execute the transfer of funds. Brandon audibly gasped on the other end of the line. The sheer relief in his voice was palpable. He immediately agreed to the terms, his arrogance rapidly beginning to reassert itself as he realized I was apparently willing to save him. He assured me he knew exactly which luxury hotel Victoria was currently hiding in and promised he could convince her to attend the meeting. He thanked me profusely, calling me the best father in the world. I did not return the sentiment. I reminded him that punctuality was non-negotiable. If they were a single minute late, the offer would be permanently rescinded. I ended the call without waiting for his reply. I placed the phone flat on the marble counter. I had no intention of releasing a single dollar. The final settlement papers were an absolute fabrication. I needed both of them securely contained in a single room, entirely distracted by their own greed. Brandon and Victoria immediately reverted to their default state of entitled arrogance. They firmly believed my sudden willingness to negotiate was rooted in a desperate desire to protect the family name from public disgrace. Brandon assumed I was terrified of a messy, highly publicized bankruptcy trial that would drag my assets into the spotlight. Victoria, driven by sheer survival instinct, calculated that signing the settlement papers was her only viable path to securing the cash she needed to flee the jurisdiction before Arthur Gallagher's corporate security team physically apprehended her. Over the next 2 days, Evelyn Sinclair received multiple arrogant emails from Victoria's personal account. The messages contained a list of aggressive demands regarding the structure of the new financial settlement. Victoria demanded the immediate release of $500,000 in untraceable funds, citing severe emotional distress caused by the asset freeze. She requested that the remaining balance be routed to an offshore account completely independent of Brandon's name. They were walking willingly into the trap, entirely blinded by their insatiable greed and their belief in my underlying parental weakness. While they spent their time drafting ridiculous financial ultimatums, I completed the final phase of my strategy. I stood at the kitchen island meticulously organizing the physical copies of the forensic audit Marcus Vance had compiled. I included the forged commercial mortgage, the falsified psychiatric evaluation, the metadata from the false abuse report, and the comprehensive ledger detailing Victoria's multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scheme. I placed the documents inside a heavy, rigid cardboard envelope. I sealed the flap securely, pressing the adhesive down with absolute finality. I picked up a black marker and printed Arthur Gallagher's direct private address across the front of the package. I drove to the main post office in the center of town. I did not use a standard mail drop. I handed the package directly to the clerk at the counter and paid for overnight tracked priority delivery requiring a direct signature upon receipt. The tracking receipt printed with a sharp mechanical hum. The dossier would arrive on the billionaire's desk on Friday morning, exactly 5 hours before Brandon and Victoria were scheduled to walk into Evelyn Sinclair's office. The chain of consequences was permanently locked in place. I walked out of the post office and into the bright afternoon sun, knowing the destruction of their fabricated empire was now entirely out of my hands. The polished mahogany clock on the wall of Evelyn Sinclair's downtown conference room chimed exactly 3 times. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Victoria marched into the room, entirely abandoning the panicked desperation she had exhibited at the bank. She was once again draped in pristine designer clothing, her posture radiating an aggressive manufactured confidence. Brandon followed closely behind her, his previous tearful submission completely erased. He had clearly managed to convince his wife that my invitation to sign settlement papers was a desperate surrender, a pathetic attempt to shield my assets and public reputation from their chaotic fallout. They moved with the synchronized arrogance of predators who believed they had successfully cornered their prey. They did not wait for an invitation to sit. Victoria pulled out a heavy leather chair directly across from me, dropping her expensive handbag onto the center of the frosted glass table with a loud, deliberate thud. Brandon took the seat beside her, crossing his arms and projecting a smug, silent solidarity. Evelyn Sinclair sat to my right, her hands folded neatly over a blank legal pad, watching them with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. Victoria leaned forward, resting her elbows on the glass. She did not offer a greeting or acknowledge Evelyn's presence. She immediately launched into a rehearsed venomous monologue. She stated that my attempt to freeze her out of the corporate accounts was a minor inconvenience, a pathetic delay tactic that had only managed to exhaust her patience. She claimed she was absolutely done playing games with a stubborn, outdated man who refused to understand the modern realities of wealth transfer. Victoria slapped her hand flat against the table, demanding a clean, untraceable payout of exactly $2 million. She declared that this exorbitant sum was the absolute minimum requirement for her to sign any dissolution paperwork and walk away without causing a catastrophic public spectacle. She explicitly demanded the funds be wired directly to her offshore accounts within the hour, bypassing Brandon entirely. She framed the demand not as a negotiation, but as a generous penalty fee I was obligated to pay for daring to interrupt her corporate ascension. She sat back in her chair, a victorious smirk playing on her lips, fully convinced her aggressive posturing had effectively terrorized me into immediate compliance. I remained completely still, allowing her arrogant demands to settle into the quiet, climate-controlled air of the conference room. Victoria interpreted my silence as capitulation. She reached into her designer bag and retrieved a manila folder, tossing it callously across the glass table. It slid to a halt directly in front of me. I recognized the seal of the corrupt physician they had bribed. Victoria stated that the folder contained the falsified psychiatric evaluation officially diagnosing me with severe advanced dementia. She explained her extortion strategy with cold, terrifying precision. If the $2 million did not arrive in her account by the end of the business day, she would leak the fraudulent medical documents directly to the local press and every major financial institution in the state. She detailed exactly how the subsequent media circus would completely destroy Josephine's professional standing. She threatened to orchestrate a public narrative claiming my wife had negligently allowed a mentally incompetent man to handle their joint finances, a scandal that would instantly invalidate Josephine's lucrative botanical patents and shatter her credibility within Arthur Gallagher's eco-resort initiative. Victoria leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, vindictive whisper. She promised to drag our entire family through the most humiliating destructive competency hearing the city had ever witnessed. She vowed to tie up every single asset we owned in endless probate litigation until we were utterly bankrupt. I shifted my gaze from the venomous woman across the table to my son. Brandon sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on mine. He did not object to his wife's monstrous threats. He did not flinch at the prospect of completely destroying his mother's lifelong scientific legacy. He simply offered a slow, deliberate nod of approval, entirely endorsing the extortion. His silent complicity marked the absolute, irreversible death of the boy I had raised. He had willingly transformed himself into an accomplice to a criminal blackmail scheme, solely to maintain his proximity to unearned wealth. He believed his willingness to destroy his own parents made him powerful. He believed he had won. I reached out and placed my hand flat against the manila folder containing their fabricated medical evidence. I did not open it. I simply pushed it aside, sliding it out of my line of sight with a casual, dismissive gesture. Victoria's smirk faltered slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing her face at my complete lack of panic. I slowly pulled back the cuff of my tailored jacket and checked my wristwatch. It was exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. The timing was flawless. I looked up and met Brandon's gaze, offering him a cold, hollow smile. Before he could demand an explanation for my silence, the heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open a second time. It was not a junior partner delivering the demanded settlement documents, nor was it a paralegal bringing refreshments. Two tall, broad-shouldered individuals stepped into the room, their dark suits and severe expressions instantly draining the oxygen from the space. The man in the lead reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy leather badge wallet, flipping it open to display a polished silver shield. He introduced himself as a senior detective with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. He did not look at Evelyn Sinclair or me. His hardened professional gaze locked directly onto Victoria and Brandon. He announced that they were interrupting the meeting to execute a high-level federal arrest warrant. He stated explicitly that the charges included corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, criminal extortion, and conspiracy to forge medical documentation. The color instantly vanished from Victoria's face, her aristocratic posture shattering as the reality of her blocked bank transaction and her exposed corporate theft finally caught up to her. Brandon scrambled backward in his leather chair, his mouth opening and closing as he desperately searched for a lie that could save him. The second detective stepped forward, unhooking a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. He instructed them both to stand and place their hands behind their backs, his voice echoing off the glass walls with absolute, inescapable authority. The trap had snapped entirely shut, locking them inside a prison of their own design. The lead detective stepped fully into the conference room, his physical presence immediately dominating the confined space. He did not rush, moving instead with the deliberate, practiced rhythm of a man who had executed this exact maneuver 100 times before. He looked at Evelyn Sinclair and me with a brief nod of professional acknowledgement before returning his hardened, unforgiving gaze to the two individuals sitting across the frosted glass table. He reached inside his heavy leather briefcase and extracted a thick, meticulously organized stack of manila folders mirroring the exact aesthetic of the extortion materials Victoria had just weaponized against me. He dropped the heavy stack directly onto the table. The folders landed with a sharp, authoritative slap, coming to rest mere inches from the fabricated psychiatric evaluation Victoria had attempted to use as blackmail. The detective placed his hands flat on the glass and leaned forward, boxing Brandon and Victoria into their chairs. He began to read from the top sheet of the first federal warrant, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. He detailed the first charge of massive corporate embezzlement, citing the exact routing numbers Victoria had attempted to access at the offshore bank that very morning. He then moved to the second warrant, shifting his intense focus directly to Brandon. He read aloud the charge of aggravated mortgage fraud, explicitly outlining how Brandon had forged Josephine's signature to illegally secure commercial lines of credit against our private land. The detective did not stop there. He opened the third folder and listed multiple counts of identity theft, explaining that the forensic audit had uncovered dozens of unauthorized wire transfers and credit applications executed using my personal credentials over the past 3 years. Finally, he read the most devastating charge of all. He announced a federal indictment for severe elder financial abuse and conspiracy to commit medical fraud. He pointed directly at the fake dementia diagnosis resting on the table, identifying it as the exact physical evidence of their criminal conspiracy. He stated that Evelyn Sinclair had proactively submitted the authentic cognitive evaluations Dr. Moore had conducted, completely invalidating their forged medical documents and exposing their extortion plot to the federal authorities. The sheer volume of the charges suffocated the room. The detectives possessed a perfectly documented paper trail detailing every single crime the couple had committed. The financial guillotine had finally dropped, severing their fabricated empire from reality. Victoria stared at the stack of federal warrants resting on the glass table, her perfectly manicured hands beginning to shake violently. The absolute reality of a federal penitentiary finally pierced her impenetrable armor of arrogance. She saw her lucrative career, her designer wardrobe, and her high society status dissolving into a bleak, concrete cell. Her legendary survival instinct, the same ruthless pragmatism that had allowed her to abandon Brandon at the charity gala, immediately took control of her actions. She did not attempt to mount a unified legal defense or stand by her husband in the face of absolute ruin. She shattered their alliance in a fraction of a second. Victoria abruptly pushed herself away from the table, putting physical distance between herself and Brandon as if his mere presence was toxic. She pointed a trembling accusatory finger directly at his chest and began to scream. Her voice lost its cultured corporate smoothness, rising into a frantic, hysterical pitch. She frantically told the detectives that she had absolutely no knowledge of the mortgage fraud or the forged signatures. She swore she had never seen the documents Brandon used to steal his parents' land and claimed she was entirely innocent of the identity theft. Victoria aggressively spun the narrative, portraying herself as a naive victim of Brandon's sophisticated financial manipulation. She insisted that he was the sole mastermind behind the unauthorized bank withdrawals and the stolen credit cards. She completely disavowed the fake dementia diagnosis she had just threatened me with, loudly claiming Brandon had forced her to bring the folder to the meeting under extreme duress. She painted a picture of a desperate, gambling-addicted husband who had secretly orchestrated the entire criminal enterprise to fund his reckless lifestyle behind her back. She begged the detectives to look at the bank routing numbers, insisting they would see Brandon's name plastered across the shell companies. She offered to become an immediate cooperating witness for the federal prosecution, promising to testify against her husband in exchange for full legal immunity. Victoria stripped away every ounce of loyalty and marital devotion she had ever feigned, offering Brandon up as the ultimate sacrificial lamb to save herself from the impending catastrophe. She stood in the corner of the conference room, breathing heavily, completely severing the parasitic bond they had shared. Brandon remained frozen in his heavy leather chair, his eyes locked onto his wife in a state of absolute paralyzed horror. The color completely drained from his face as Victoria's venomous accusations echoed against the acoustic panels of the conference room. He was not reacting to the federal warrants or the impending reality of a lengthy prison sentence. He was reacting to the profound, terrifying realization that the woman he had worshipped, the woman for whom he had betrayed his own flesh and blood, possessed absolutely zero loyalty to him. He watched her frantically negotiate his destruction with the federal detectives, offering up his freedom to purchase her own salvation. The grand, arrogant illusion of their untouchable partnership collapsed into pathetic fragments. Brandon finally understood that he had never been an equal partner in their marriage. He had only ever been a highly convenient tool, a temporary asset Victoria had leveraged for corporate advancement and discarded the exact moment he became a liability. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to scream that the corporate embezzlement was entirely her design, but the sheer shock of her betrayal robbed him of his voice. He slumped forward, staring at the frosted glass, entirely consumed by the crushing weight of his isolation. He had sacrificed his parents, his integrity, and his future for a woman who was currently begging the police to lock him in a federal penitentiary. The lead detective ignored Victoria's frantic bargaining. He was intimately familiar with the desperate, selfish mechanics of corporate criminals turning on one another the moment the walls closed in. He stepped forward, signaling his partner to proceed with the arrests. The second detective unclipped the steel handcuffs from his belt and walked directly toward Victoria. He grabbed her trembling arm, ignoring her shrill protests and her desperate promises of full cooperation. He forcefully twisted her wrist behind her back, the metallic click of the restraints cutting sharply through her hysterical pleading. Victoria gasped, her eyes darting wildly around the room as the cold steel locked into place. The lead detective stepped toward Brandon, reaching for his own set of restraints. Before he could issue the formal Miranda warning, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the room. The heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open a second time, halting the detectives in their tracks and forcing everyone to turn toward the hallway. The sharp knock at the heavy oak doors echoed like a gunshot, instantly freezing the detective's hand just inches from Brandon's wrist. The heavy brass handle turned, and the doors swung wide open. Arthur Gallagher stepped into the conference room. The billionaire did not look like the polished, charming host who had addressed the charity gala just days prior. He looked like a man ready to execute a corporate slaughter. Tucked firmly under his right arm was the heavy, rigid cardboard priority mail envelope I had personally addressed and shipped to his private residence. He marched past the two federal detectives without asking for permission, his sheer gravitational authority commanding absolute silence. He stopped directly at the edge of the frosted glass table towering over Victoria. She shrank back into her leather chair, her eyes widening in absolute terror as she recognized the tracking label on the package. Gallagher ripped the sealed flap open with a violent tearing sound. He reached inside and pulled out the thick stack of forensic ledgers, the highlighted routing numbers, and the falsified vendor invoices documenting her $4 million theft. He did not hand them to her gently. Gallagher slammed the entire stack directly onto the glass table right in front of Victoria's face with a force that rattled the conference room windows. The glossy pages slid and scattered across the smooth surface, fanning out to display the undeniable mathematical proof of her embezzlement. Gallagher's voice was dangerously quiet, a low, vibrating growl that promised absolute ruin. He informed Victoria that he had spent his entire morning reviewing every single fraudulent requisition order she had ever filed. He told her she was a parasite who had infected his supply chain, draining resources to fund a pathetic synthetic illusion of wealth. Victoria opened her mouth desperately, trying to summon the same lies she had just pitched to the detectives. She stammered out a fragile claim that Brandon had manipulated the accounts behind her back. Gallagher cut her off instantly, his voice cracking like a whip. He stated that the audit explicitly traced the encrypted IP addresses directly to her secure office terminal, proving she had authorized the transfers while sitting at a desk he paid for. Victoria trembled violently, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair as her entire fabricated reality collapsed under the weight of Gallagher's fury. She desperately attempted to salvage a shred of her corporate dignity, stammering that her procurement strategies had generated massive revenue for the eco-resort division, claiming she was a vital asset to his company despite the financial discrepancies. Gallagher let out a harsh, humorless laugh that stripped away the final layers of her arrogance. He leaned over the table, placing his large hands flat against the scattered evidence, and forced Victoria to look him directly in the eyes. He revealed the ultimate crushing irony of her entire existence. He explained the fundamental financial architecture of his eco-resort initiative, a project that had cost hundreds of millions of dollars to develop. He stated clearly that the entire division was operating on a razor-thin profit margin. The only reason the eco-resort was successfully staying afloat, the sole reason Victoria even had a department to embezzle from, was because of Josephine and me. Gallagher explained to the silent room that my wife held the exclusive, highly lucrative patents for the specific botanical preservation technology necessary to keep the resort functioning. He revealed that Josephine and I had voluntarily licensed those patents to his corporation at a severely discounted rate out of sheer kindness and a shared commitment to environmental conservation. We had effectively subsidized his company with our own intellectual property. The realization hit Victoria with the force of a physical blow. The lavish corporate lifestyle she worshipped, the massive salary she drew, and the millions she had stolen were entirely sustained by the charity of the very people she despised. She had spent years mocking our modest home, sneering at our 10-year-old truck, and treating us like impoverished burdens. She had humiliated us at family dinners and gala events, fully convinced of her absolute superiority. In reality, she was living entirely on our goodwill. We were the silent architects of her success, handing her the very ladder she used to look down on us. Brandon sat entirely paralyzed, his breath catching, as he realized the staggering magnitude of his parents' true power. He had chosen to align himself with a thief, throwing away his inheritance and his family, completely unaware that we literally owned the foundation of the empire he tried so desperately to climb. The heavy silence in the conference room was absolute, broken only by Victoria's ragged, panicked breathing. She looked at me, sitting calmly beside Evelyn Sinclair, and finally understood the devastating totality of my silent adjustment. I had not just taken away her stolen money. I had completely dismantled the illusion of her superiority. Arthur Gallagher stood up straight, adjusting his impeccably tailored suit, and delivered the final professional execution. He addressed Victoria not as an executive, but as a criminal trespasser. He announced that she was officially terminated from his corporation effective immediately. He promised to personally ensure she was globally blacklisted across the entire procurement and hospitality industry. She would never sit in a corporate boardroom or manage a legitimate supply chain ever again. Furthermore, he explicitly declared his intention to sue her in civil court for corporate espionage and systemic theft, vowing to strip away whatever meager assets she had left to her name after the federal government finished with her. Gallagher paused, glancing down at Victoria's perfectly manicured, trembling hands resting on the edge of the glass table. He reminded her of the cruel, arrogant comments she had made during Brandon's birthday party the night she had openly mocked my calloused working-class hands and dismissed me as a pathetic old man. Gallagher's voice rang with absolute unforgiving clarity as he pointed out that those exact filthy hands she had despised were the hands that had built the patents, funded the trust, and ultimately controlled the survival of her entire career. The federal detectives stepped forward seamlessly, resuming their duties. The lead detective grabbed Victoria's arm, pulling her out of the plush leather chair with zero gentleness. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked sharply around her wrists, binding her hands behind her back. The second detective moved to Brandon, lifting him from his seat and securing his wrists with the same mechanical efficiency. Neither of them spoke. Their arrogance, their threats, and their demands were completely extinguished. The detectives marched them toward the heavy oak doors, leading them out of the elegant conference room and into the bleak reality of the federal justice system. I remained seated at the table, my hands resting quietly on the cool glass. I did not watch them leave. I simply listened to the heavy doors click shut, sealing the end of the conflict and restoring absolute order. The lead detective halted Victoria just inches from the heavy oak doors, gripping her arm with a force that made her gasp. He forcefully turned her around to face the frosted glass wall of the conference room, pressing her shoulder against the sleek surface to maintain absolute control. He began to recite the Miranda warning. His voice was a flat, monotonous drone that contrasted violently with the sheer escalating hysteria ripping through the room. He informed her of her right to remain silent, a cruel irony for a woman who had spent the last 20 minutes screaming arrogant demands and extortion threats. Victoria's knees buckled. Her immaculate designer handbag, the ultimate symbol of the fabricated high society status she worshipped, slipped from her trembling shoulder. It hit the floor and spilled its contents across the plush corporate carpet. Expensive cosmetics, platinum credit cards, and the keys to a luxury car she no longer owned scattered aimlessly around her silver heels. She completely broke down, weeping with loud, ragged gasps that echoed terribly in the enclosed space. She twisted her neck, looking frantically at Arthur Gallagher, begging him for a second chance. She pleaded that she could undo the wire transfers, promising to work for free, swearing she would dedicate her life to repaying every single stolen cent. Gallagher simply turned his back on her, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows, entirely dismissing her existence. In less than 10 minutes, Victoria had lost her multi-million-dollar offshore accounts, her prestigious executive position, her pristine reputation, and her physical freedom. The detective ignored her frantic sobbing, hauling her firmly upright by the steel chain of the handcuffs. He pushed the heavy doors open and dragged her out into the corridor. Her expensive heels dragged against the polished floor, her desperate cries fading down the hallway until the heavy doors swung shut, sealing her fate completely. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was thick and suffocating. The second federal detective had pushed Brandon back down into his leather chair, instructing him to remain perfectly still while building security cleared a separate freight elevator for his transport. Brandon sat frozen, his wrists locked tightly behind his back. He was physically shivering, his shoulders shaking as the massive surge of adrenaline crashed, and the bleak, terrifying reality of a federal penitentiary loomed before him. He looked at Gallagher's rigid back, finding no mercy there. He turned his head and fixed his wide, terrified eyes directly on me. The arrogant, untouchable corporate executive persona he had worn like a suit of armor was entirely gone. Sitting in that chair was the frightened, desperate little boy who used to run to me to fix his broken toys and clean up his mistakes. His jaw trembled violently as he finally spoke. He used the word he had deliberately avoided for years. He called me Dad. His voice was a fractured, pathetic whisper as he begged me for help. He pleaded with me to hire Evelyn Sinclair to represent him. He frantically reasoned that since Victoria was the one who actually stole the corporate funds, he only needed a top-tier defense attorney to fight the mortgage fraud and forgery charges. He promised he would do whatever I wanted. He swore he would give up the city, move back to the suburbs, and work in the dirt if only I would use my resources to keep him out of a federal holding cell. He desperately reminded me that we were family crying, that blood had to mean something. He leaned entirely on the illusion of unconditional parental love, completely ignoring the fact that just moments prior he had smiled in silent agreement while his wife threatened to destroy his mother's legacy and lock me in a psychiatric ward. I sat at the table and observed the tears streaming down my son's face. I watched the pathetic, uncontrollable tremor in his shoulders. I did not feel a sudden surge of vindication or a triumphant rush of victory. I felt an absolute chilling emptiness where my parental devotion used to reside. I placed my hands flat on the cool glass table and slowly pushed my chair back. I stood up to my full height, towering over the shivering man in the chair. I took a slow, deliberate moment to button my tailored suit jacket, smoothing the dark fabric with steady, calloused hands. Evelyn Sinclair sat silently to my right, her pen resting on her legal pad, watching the final execution of the contract. Arthur Gallagher turned away from the window, his severe gaze locked on the unfolding scene. Brandon looked up at me with desperate, pleading eyes, waiting for the unconditional rescue he still fundamentally believed was his birthright. I looked down at him and addressed his frantic begging with absolute surgical clarity. I did not raise my voice or offer an angry lecture on morality. I simply reminded him of the exact devastating words his wife had used when she slapped my wife with the reality of their secret wedding. I delivered the phrase with a cold, unwavering precision that shattered the last remaining fragment of his hope. I told him that I only help special people. I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence of the room amplify the weight of the sentence. I maintained direct eye contact as I delivered the final, undeniable truth of our relationship. I told him that he did not qualify. I turned away from the glass table and walked toward the heavy oak doors, falling into step beside Arthur Gallagher. I did not look back as I walked out of the conference room, leaving my son to the detectives and the absolute ruin he had built for himself. As I turned toward the heavy oak doors, Brandon's voice cracked, shattering the silence of the room. He did not accept my refusal. He scrambled against the federal detective's grip, launching a desperate secondary plea. If I would not save him from a federal prison sentence, he begged me to at least save his home. He sobbed openly, claiming that the banks were threatening to lock him out, that he would be entirely homeless while attempting to fight the federal indictments. He asked for a bridge loan, pleading for just enough liquid capital to cover the mortgage arrears and keep a roof over his head. I stopped walking. I turned back around, studying the pathetic, trembling figure of the man who had willingly forged his mother's signature to steal her land. I walked slowly back to the frosted glass table. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and withdrew a crumpled, heavily creased document. I had intercepted it from his mail pile days ago during my initial investigation. I placed it flat on the glass, pressing the creases out directly in front of him. I told him it was the final non-negotiable foreclosure notice. I read the bold print aloud, stating that the primary lending institution was executing a complete seizure of the property at exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning. I watched his eyes dart across the page, the reality of his impending homelessness finally setting in. He stammered, asking how I could possibly allow the bank to take his house when I possessed the liquid capital to pay the balance 10 times over. I leaned over the table, bringing my face level with his. I kept my voice entirely devoid of warmth. I informed him that I would not authorize a single cent to halt the foreclosure. I explained that the house was never truly his to begin with. It was a massive, unsustainable liability financed entirely through Victoria's embezzlement and his own fraudulent lines of credit. I told him that the bank was simply reclaiming stolen property. He was not losing a home. He was being formally evicted from a crime scene. I made it absolutely clear that my wealth, the very fortune he had spent months trying to steal, would remain permanently out of his reach. Brandon sagged against the detective's grip, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He attempted to deflect the blame one final time, whining that Victoria had forced him into the lavish lifestyle, that the crushing debt had trapped him in a cycle he could not escape. I did not allow him to finish his pathetic rationalization. I cut him off, my voice ringing with absolute clinical authority. I told him that his current devastation was not the result of Victoria's manipulation, but the direct consequence of his own insatiable greed. I outlined the exact catastrophic cost of his arrogance. I reminded him that he had been born into a family that offered him unconditional support, a massive unencumbered inheritance, and a lifetime of security. He had willingly traded that unparalleled fortune for a shallow synthetic illusion of status. He had sacrificed his integrity to impress a woman who viewed him as a disposable asset. He had attempted to declare his own father mentally incompetent and rip the foundation from beneath his mother's feet. I told him he had gambled his family, his fortune, and his dignity, and he had lost everything. I gestured toward the federal detective standing firmly at his side. I explicitly laid out his immediate future. I informed Brandon that he would not have access to Evelyn Sinclair or any of the high-priced corporate defense attorneys Arthur Gallagher employed. He would be processed through the federal holding facility like any other common criminal. He would stand before a federal judge and face aggravated forgery and mortgage fraud indictments entirely on his own. He would be assigned an overworked, underpaid public defender. He would be forced to navigate the unforgiving machinery of the criminal justice system without a safety net, without a trust fund, and without my protection. He had constantly demanded independence from my outdated working-class values, and now he had it. He was entirely independent, isolated, and legally defenseless against the full weight of the federal government. As the gravity of his isolation crushed the last remnants of his defiance, the heavy oak doors of the conference room opened one final time. Josephine stepped quietly across the threshold. She had been waiting in Evelyn Sinclair's private office, listening to the absolute destruction of the empire our son had tried to steal. Brandon looked up, his tear-streaked face contorting into a mask of desperate hope. He saw his mother and instinctively reached out against his restraints, begging her to intervene, begging her to convince me to show mercy. Josephine did not rush to comfort him. She did not offer a tearful embrace or a gentle word of reassurance. She stopped beside me, looking down at the man who had forged her name and conspired to strip away her botanical patents. Her expression was completely unreadable, a mask of profound, unshakable strength. She looked at Brandon, examining the wreckage of his arrogance, and simply shook her head. She did not speak a single word to him. Her absolute silence was a definitive, devastating verdict. It was the final severing of the bloodline. I reached out and gently took Josephine's hand in mine. Her grip was firm, resolute, and completely anchored in our shared reality. I gave her a small, reassuring nod. Together we turned our backs on the trembling figure in the leather chair. We walked out of the conference room, our footsteps steady and synchronized against the polished hardwood floor of the corridor. The federal detectives remained behind, preparing to transport their prisoner to a holding cell. We did not pause, and we did not look back. We left Brandon sitting completely alone in the center of the vast, silent conference room. He was surrounded only by the scattered forensic ledgers detailing his crimes, the crumpled foreclosure notice condemning him to homelessness, and the suffocating ruins of his own insatiable greed. The silent adjustment was finally complete. The empire of lies was permanently dead, and we were completely free to walk into the future. The harsh fluorescent lights of the overnight logistics warehouse flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the concrete floor. Brandon dragged a heavy push broom across the loading dock, his shoulders aching with a dull, persistent throb he had never known in his previous life. Exactly 1 month had passed since the heavy oak doors of Evelyn Sinclair's conference room had closed behind him. The swift mechanical efficiency of the bank's foreclosure department had stripped away his suburban fortress in a matter of days. He had returned from federal holding on bail only to find heavy brass padlocks on his front door and a stark legal notice taped to the glass. He currently rented a cramped, damp room in a boarding house on the industrial edge of the city. Every single dollar he earned pushing debris across the warehouse floor was immediately wired to a low-tier defense attorney who offered him absolutely no guarantees. He possessed no trust fund, no corporate safety net, and no family to bail him out. He spent his nights performing the exact type of manual labor he had spent his entire life mocking. Across the state, Victoria sat in a highly restricted federal detention center, her bail completely denied due to her documented attempts to wire millions to untraceable offshore accounts. She wore a standard-issue jumpsuit, her designer wardrobe replaced by coarse cotton. Her federal trial date loomed on the horizon, carrying a mandatory minimum sentence that ensured she would spend the next 2 decades behind bars. She had attempted to leverage a plea deal by offering to testify against Brandon, but the federal prosecutors did not need her cooperation. Arthur Gallagher's forensic audit provided a flawless, impenetrable roadmap of her entire embezzlement scheme. The parasitic alliance that had fueled their marriage was dead, leaving them both completely isolated to face the crushing consequences of their own arrogance. Brandon paused his sweeping to wipe the sweat from his forehead. He looked at his blistering, calloused palms. He finally understood the absolute, undeniable cost of his greed. He had traded a lifetime of unconditional security for a fleeting illusion of power, and now he was paying the price with every painful step he took across the concrete. The glossy, heavy-stock cover of the National Botanical Magazine gleamed under the bright lights of newsstands across the country. It was the most anticipated issue of the decade within the ecological science community, entirely dedicated to Arthur Gallagher's revolutionary eco-resort initiative. The cover did not feature Gallagher's billionaire profile or the sleek architecture of his sustainable hotels. Instead, the publication chose a striking, intimately profound photograph. The image was a high-resolution close-up of a pair of hands cradling a stunning, vibrant crimson flower. The hands in the photograph were not manicured, delicate, or adorned with platinum jewelry. They were Josephine's hands. The camera captured every deep crease, every permanent stain of dark soil embedded beneath the nails, and the thick, undeniable calluses that mapped a lifetime of relentless physical labor. The caption below the image read in bold, elegant typography, introducing the world to the hybrid rose that had effectively stabilized an entire environmental ecosystem. It was officially registered and patented under the name The Howard. The accompanying article detailed the exhaustive, decades-long process Josephine had undertaken in the quiet solitude of our backyard greenhouse. The narrative revealed the final pieces of our shared history. While Victoria and Brandon had spent years sneering at Josephine's worn gardening clothes and mocking her calloused fingers at high society dinners, my wife had been meticulously engineering a botanical breakthrough. She had cross-pollinated indigenous strains to create a resilient, drought-resistant hybrid that Arthur Gallagher's corporate empire absolutely depended upon for their sustainable infrastructure. The article explicitly highlighted the sheer generosity of the patent licensing agreement we had established, cementing Josephine's status not just as a brilliant horticulturist, but as a primary architect of a billion-dollar conservation effort. The publication transformed the very physical traits Victoria had mocked into badges of supreme honor. Josephine's rough-weathered hands were universally celebrated as the instruments of profound scientific creation. The magazine effectively broadcasted the ultimate irony to the entire financial and scientific world. The quiet, unassuming woman who refused to flaunt her wealth possessed an intellectual and financial empire that completely dwarfed the pathetic stolen illusions her son and daughter-in-law had sacrificed their lives to maintain. The early morning air on our back porch was crisp and entirely still. There were no frantic phone calls demanding emergency wire transfers. There were no arrogant ultimatums echoing from ungrateful children, and there was no suffocating tension hanging in the atmosphere. There was only the quiet, rhythmic chirping of the cicadas and the gentle rustle of the wind moving through the dense foliage of Josephine's garden. We sat side by side in our worn wooden rocking chairs, watching the sun crest over the horizon and cast long golden shadows across the meticulously cultivated flower beds. I held a steaming mug of black coffee in my left hand. I did not feel the crushing, exhausting weight of parental guilt that had burdened me for the past decade. The painful surgical extraction of Brandon from our lives had left a scar, but the wound was finally clean. We had not sought revenge or orchestrated a malicious downfall. We had simply established an absolute boundary and allowed the sheer force of their own corruption to consume them. I reached across the armrest with my right hand and gently covered Josephine's hand where it rested on her lap. I traced the deep, familiar lines of her palm with my thumb. I felt the rough, hardened ridges of the calluses that the entire world had just seen on the cover of a national magazine. I did not feel pity for the decades of hard labor we had endured to build our foundation. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of pride. Those hands had raised a child, built a home, engineered a scientific marvel, and ultimately held the absolute power to dismantle a criminal conspiracy. Josephine turned her head and looked at me, her eyes reflecting the bright morning sun. She did not offer a grand, dramatic statement about our victory or waste a single breath mourning the son who had tried to destroy us. She simply offered a quiet, genuine smile, her shoulders completely relaxed for the first time in years. We sat together in the absolute unbreakable peace of two people who had successfully defended their empire and preserved their dignity. The silent adjustment was permanent, leaving us completely free to enjoy the beautiful, unbothered reality of the life we had earned. The harsh fluorescent lights of the overnight logistics warehouse flickered relentlessly. Brandon dragged a heavy broom across the loading dock, his shoulders aching with a dull throb. Exactly 1 month had passed since the conference room doors permanently closed. A brutal foreclosure stripped away his suburban fortress in mere days. He returned from federal holding to find padlocks on his door. He rented a cramped, damp room on the city's industrial edge. Every single dollar earned pushing debris was wired to a cheap defense attorney. He possessed no family to bail him out. He spent nights performing manual labor he had spent his life mocking. Across the state, Victoria sat in a federal detention center. Her bail was denied due to attempts to hide offshore millions. She wore a standard jumpsuit, her designer wardrobe replaced by coarse cotton. Her trial loomed, carrying a mandatory sentence of 2 decades. Gallagher's audit provided a flawless roadmap of her embezzlement. The parasitic alliance that fueled their marriage was dead. Brandon wiped sweat from his forehead, staring at his blistered palms. He finally understood the undeniable cost of his greed. He traded unconditional security for a fleeting illusion and lost everything. The glossy cover of the National Botanical Magazine gleamed on newsstands across the country. It was the most anticipated issue of the decade dedicated to Gallagher's revolutionary ecological initiative. The cover did not feature Gallagher's profile. Instead, the image was a clear portrait of hands cradling a stunning crimson flower. The hands were not manicured or adorned with platinum. They were Josephine's hands. The camera captured every deep crease, every stain of dark soil, and the thick calluses mapping a lifetime of relentless labor. The caption introduced the world to the hybrid rose that stabilized an entire environmental ecosystem. It was patented under the name The Howard. The article detailed the lengthy process Josephine had undertaken in our backyard greenhouse. While Victoria and Brandon had spent years sneering at Josephine's worn gardening clothes, my wife had engineered a breakthrough. She created a hardy hybrid that Gallagher's corporate empire depended upon for their infrastructure. Josephine's rough-weathered hands were universally celebrated as instruments of profound scientific creation. The early morning air on our back porch was crisp and entirely still. There were no frantic phone calls demanding wire transfers. There were no arrogant ultimatums echoing from ungrateful children. There was only the quiet chirping of the cicadas and the gentle rustle of the wind moving through Josephine's garden. We sat side by side in our wooden rocking chairs, watching the sun crest over the horizon. I held a steaming mug of black coffee, completely free of the parental guilt that had burdened me for the past decade. We had simply established an absolute boundary and allowed their corruption to consume them. I reached across the armrest and gently covered Josephine's hand. I traced the familiar lines of her palm, feeling the rough, hardened calluses that the entire world had just seen on the magazine cover. I felt a profound sense of pride. Those hands had built a home, engineered a scientific marvel, and dismantled a criminal conspiracy. Josephine turned and offered a genuine smile, her shoulders completely relaxed. We sat together in the unbreakable peace of two people who successfully defended their empire and preserved their dignity. Reflecting on the wreckage of the lives Brandon and Victoria built, a profound realization emerges about the true nature of power. Genuine authority does not reside in stolen titles, fabricated psychiatric evaluations, or offshore bank accounts. True power is cultivated in absolute silence, forged through decades of unyielding labor resilience and unwavering moral clarity. When arrogant individuals mistake quiet humility for weakness, they fundamentally miscalculate the very architecture of survival. Wealth that is forcefully extracted through manipulation is fragile and inevitably collapses under the weight of its own deceit. However, an empire built on authentic creation, mutual respect, and quiet dignity remains entirely impenetrable. A family is not a financial resource to be brutally exploited, and love should never be weaponized as an instrument of extortion. The ultimate defense against toxic ambition is the courage to sever the poisoned bloodline without an ounce of regret. We must rigorously protect our sanctuaries and recognize that a true legacy is measured by the strength of our calluses, not the depth of our pockets. When faced with entitled manipulation, the most devastating response is simply withdrawing your grace. Reflect on times when arrogant individuals mistook your quiet kindness for absolute vulnerability. Consider how you established boundaries to protect your own peace and dignity from those who sought to exploit your generosity. Please share your unique experiences in the comments below. Also, please subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories of resilience and let us continue building unshakable legacies together.